What's up, Dream Explorers? Welcome back to another journey into the absolutely wild intersection of sleep and human discovery. Tonight we're diving into some of the most mind-bending stories. You've probably never heard tales of brave or completely insane souls who literally followed maps they'd seen in their dreams to discover new continents, hidden treasures, and lands that would reshape our entire understanding of the world. Now, before you settle in for what's probably going to be the strangest geography lesson of your life, go ahead and hit that like button if you're into these bizarre historical adventures, and subscribe if you genuinely find yourself coming back for more of this weirdness. I'm always curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and what ungodly hour it is in your corner of the world. It's like creating this global network of insomniacs united by historically questionable decision-making. And hey, get comfortable because we're about to explore how some of history's most legendary explorers, from Columbus to Captain Cook, didn't just stumble upon new worlds by accident. They followed detailed maps that appeared to them in dreams, navigated by star patterns they'd never studied, and trusted their sleeping minds to guide them across oceans that mapmakers insisted were impossible to cross. And honestly, if you end up falling asleep somewhere in the middle of this adventure, that's totally fine. Actually, that's kind of the whole idea here. I've been researching this topic for weeks, and I gotta say, the idea that some of our most important geographical discoveries came from visions people had while unconscious is both fascinating and slightly terrifying. It's like, what if the entire map of the world was drawn by people following directions from their dreams? Anyway, let's start with perhaps the most famous case of dream-guided exploration in history. So everyone knows the basic story of Columbus discovering America in 1492, right? Spanish crown, 3 ships, thought he was going to Asia, ended up in the Caribbean instead. But what they don't teach you in school is that Columbus's entire navigation strategy came from a series of incredibly detailed dreams about sailing west to reach the east. Now let me paint you a picture of what Columbus was actually dealing with in 1492. This guy was basically trying to convince European monarchs to fund what everyone else thought was a suicide mission based on calculations that were obviously wrong. The educated world knew the Earth was round, but they also knew it was way too big to sail west from Europe to Asia without dying of starvation somewhere in the middle of an endless ocean. See, Columbus wasn't just some random sailor with a crazy idea. He was an experienced navigator who'd spent years studying every available map, chart, and travel account he could get his hands on. He'd read Marco Polo's descriptions of Asian wealth, he'd studied ancient Greek calculations about the Earth's size, and he'd even corresponded with learned scholars about the possibility of reaching Asia by sailing west. But here's the thing, all the math was against him. The best estimates of the time suggested that the distance from Europe to Asia by sailing west was about 12,000 miles of open ocean. With the ships and supplies available in the 5th-10th century, that was essentially a death sentence. No crew could survive that long at sea without fresh water and food. Columbus had been having these dreams since he was a teenager working as a wool merchant in Genoa. In his dreams, he would find himself standing on the deck of a ship, sailing west across an ocean that seemed to go on forever. But instead of endless water, he would see islands appearing on the horizon, tropical paradises with golden beaches and people wearing strange clothes. The dream started when he was about 17, right around the time he began working on merchant ships in the Mediterranean. At first, they were just vague visions, glimpses of unknown coastlines, the sound of waves breaking on unfamiliar shores, the smell of spices and flowers that didn't exist in Europe. But as Columbus gained more experience as a sailor, his dreams became incredibly detailed. He could see specific islands with distinctive geological features, volcanic peaks, coral reefs, rivers flowing into protected harbors. He could describe the vegetation, the wildlife, even the weather patterns of places that didn't exist on any known map. The really bizarre part is that Columbus's dreams included specific navigation details that he had no way of knowing. He dreamed about wind patterns, ocean currents, and star configurations that wouldn't be documented by European sailors for another century. His dream map showed exactly where to catch favorable winds, where to find fresh water, and even which islands would have friendly inhabitants. In one recurring dream, Columbus found himself studying charts that seemed to be drawn by someone with perfect knowledge of the Atlantic Ocean. These dream charts showed the exact locations of islands, the precise directions of ocean currents, and even seasonal weather patterns that would affect sailing conditions. The charts in his dreams were unlike anything that existed in the real world. European mapmakers in the 5th-10th century were working with incomplete information, guesswork, and theories based on ancient texts. But Columbus's dream charts were accurate down to the smallest details: the depth of harbors, the direction of prevailing winds, even the times of year when different routes would be most favorable. Sometimes the best GPS comes from a subconscious that apparently has access to satellite imagery. But here's where it gets really weird. Columbus's dreams weren't just about finding new lands. They were about finding a completely different route to the same destinations that other explorers were trying to reach by going around Africa. In his dreams, he saw himself trading with the same Asian merchants that Marco Polo had written about, except he was reaching them by sailing west instead of east. Columbus's dream Asia wasn't the mysterious, distant land that Europeans imagined. In his sleeping visions, he walked through bustling markets and cities that gleamed with gold and precious stones. He talked with merchants who wore silk robes and traded in spices that made European cuisine seem bland and primitive. But the most remarkable aspect of these dreams was how they solved the fundamental problem that had stumped every navigator who'd considered a westward voyage to Asia, the problem of distance. Columbus's dream showed him that the journey wasn't 12,000 miles of empty ocean, but a series of shorter hops between islands that would provide fresh water, food, and safe harbors. In his dreams, Columbus could see exactly how the voyage would unfold. He would sail southwest from the Canary Islands, catch the trade wains that would carry him quickly across the Atlantic, and then island hop his way to the Asian mainland. The total journey time would be about 5 weeks, challenging, but not impossible with proper planning and preparation. Columbus became obsessed with these dreams to the point where he filled multiple journals with detailed descriptions of the islands he'd seen, the people he'd met, and the trade goods he'd discovered. His family and friends thought he was losing his mind. Their successful merchant was spending all his time drawing maps of places that didn't exist and planning voyages to lands that were probably impossible to reach. But Columbus couldn't shake the conviction that his dreams were more than just fantasy. The details were too specific, too consistent, and too practical to be mere imagination. He began to believe that God was communicating with him through his dreams, providing him with the knowledge necessary to spread Christianity to the far corners of the earth. This religious interpretation of his dreams was crucial for Columbus's eventual success in securing funding. When he approached European monarchs with his proposal, he wasn't just offering them a new trade route, he was promising them the opportunity to fulfill their Christian duty by bringing the gospel to previously unreachable populations. When Columbus finally convinced Queen Isabella to fund his expedition, he wasn't just hoping to find something. He was following a specific roadmap that had been downloaded into his brain during REM sleep. The contract he signed with the Spanish crown was remarkably specific about what he expected to find and when he expected to find it. The preparations for the voyage were guided entirely by insights Columbus had gained from his dreams. He knew exactly what supplies to bring, what types of ships would be most suitable, and even what time of year would provide the most favorable sailing conditions. His crew thought he was either remarkably experienced or remarkably lucky in his planning decisions. Columbus selected his ships based on specifications he'd seen in his dreams. The Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria weren't just random vessels. They were specifically chosen because Columbus had dreamed about ships with exactly their characteristics successfully completing the westward voyage. The crew selection was equally guided by dream knowledge. Columbus chose sailors who matched the personalities and skills of crew members he'd encountered in his sleeping visions. He knew which types of people would handle the psychological stress of oceanic exploration and which would become problems during extended periods at sea. The voyage itself unfolded exactly as Columbus had dreamed it. He knew exactly when to change course to catch favorable winds, where to expect storms, and even predicted the exact day when land would be sighted. His crew thought he was either divinely inspired or completely insane, and honestly, they might have been right about both. On October 11, 1492, when Columbus ordered his ships to change course from west-southwest back to due west, he gave no explanation for the decision. But this course correction, which seemed arbitrary to his crew, was based entirely on knowledge he'd gained from his dreams. Without this change, the expedition would have missed San Salvador and probably ended in disaster on the reefs near Long Island. The psychological impact on his crew during the voyage was enormous. These were experienced sailors who'd never seen anyone navigate with such confidence in completely unknown waters. Columbus would point to empty horizon and say, "We'll see land tomorrow morning," and then land would appear exactly when he predicted. Columbus's dream knowledge extended beyond just navigation. He knew what to expect when they made landfall, the appearance of the indigenous peoples, their likely reactions to European visitors, even which trade goods would be most valuable for establishing relationships. When Columbus reached the Caribbean, he immediately recognized the islands from his dreams. He knew which ones would have fresh water, which ones had gold, and which ones had populations that would be friendly to European visitors. It wasn't exploration, it was following a supernatural treasure map. The first island they encountered, which Columbus named San Salvador, matched his dream visions perfectly. He knew where to find safe anchorage, where fresh water springs were located, and even which areas of the island would be most suitable for establishing temporary camps. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Columbus's dream-guided exploration was his immediate recognition that he hadn't reached Asia. Despite his public claims about finding the Indies, Columbus's private journals reveal that he understood from the beginning that he'd discovered something entirely. New lands that existed in his dreams but weren't part of any known geography. The indigenous peoples Columbus encountered also seemed familiar from his sleeping visions. He recognized their physical appearance, their clothing styles, and even their social structures from dreams he'd been having for decades. This recognition allowed him to establish relationships more quickly than would have been possible if he'd been encountering completely unknown cultures. Columbus's dream knowledge also extended to the economic potential of his discoveries. He knew which islands contained gold deposits, which had valuable tropical products, and which locations would be most suitable for establishing permanent European settlements. Dreams don't just show you new worlds. Sometimes they give you the keys to finding them. The really fascinating part is how Columbus's dream-guided voyage changed the entire trajectory of human history. His success proved that ocean exploration guided by supernatural visions could produce tangible results, inspiring countless other explorers to pay attention to their own dreams and sleeping visions. But Columbus's dreams didn't stop with his first voyage. Throughout his subsequent expeditions to the Caribbean, he continued to receive navigational guidance through his sleeping visions. He would dream about new islands before discovering them, and he would often know the optimal routes for reaching previously unvisited locations. The psychological impact of Columbus's success extended far beyond navigation and exploration. His dream-guided voyage demonstrated that individual consciousness could access information that transcended normal human knowledge, opening up new possibilities for understanding the relationship between sleep, intuition, and practical achievement. Columbus's journals from his later voyages contain increasingly detailed descriptions of his navigational dreams. He wrote about receiving not just geographical information, but cultural and economic intelligence that helped him understand how to interact with indigenous populations and how to identify valuable resources. The dream guidance also revealed long-term consequences of European colonization that Columbus couldn't have understood through normal reasoning. His sleeping visions showed him glimpses of how his discoveries would affect both European and American civilizations over the following centuries. Modern analysis of Columbus's navigational decisions reveals patterns that are difficult to explain through conventional sailing knowledge available in the 15th century. His route selections, timing decisions, and resource management strategies all suggest access to information that went beyond normal human capabilities. The accuracy of Columbus's dream navigation has inspired speculation about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to time and space. Some researchers propose that extreme focus on geographical exploration might have allowed Columbus to access information through quantum consciousness or morphic field connections. But regardless of the mechanism behind his supernatural navigation, Columbus's dream-guided voyage remains one of the most consequential examples of sleep vision leading to world-changing discovery. His willingness to trust his subconscious knowledge literally reshaped the map of the world and initiated a new era of global exploration and cultural exchange. The psychological techniques Columbus developed for accessing and interpreting his navigational dreams influenced subsequent generations of explorers, many of whom adopted similar approaches to using sleep visions for geographical discovery. Columbus's story demonstrates that sometimes the most important journeys begin not with careful planning and logical analysis, but with the courage to follow visions that seem impossible until they prove to be true. His dream-guided voyage across the Atlantic Ocean opened up possibilities that transformed human civilization and proved that consciousness operates by rules we're only beginning to understand. Moving forward about 50 years, we get to one of the most expensive wild goose chases in exploration history: Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's search for the 7 cities of gold. But what most people don't know is that Coronado's entire expedition was based on incredibly detailed dreams about golden cities that existed somewhere in the American Southwest. Now, let me set the scene for what was happening in 1540, because this was basically the Spanish Empire at its most confident and most delusional. The conquistadors had just finished looting the Aztec and Inca empires. They had more gold than they knew what to do with, and they were absolutely convinced that there were even more fabulous civilizations out there just waiting to be discovered and plundered. Coronado was a Spanish conquistador who'd heard rumors about fabulous cities of gold somewhere north of Mexico. These weren't just random stories. They were detailed accounts from Spanish explorers who claimed to have seen golden cities from a distance, cities so bright they hurt your eyes to look at directly. The rumors had started with Hernández Cabeza de Vaca, who'd survived 8 years wandering through what's now the American Southwest after a shipwreck. When he finally made it back to Spanish territory, he brought stories about cities where people used gold and silver for everyday objects, where even the humblest peasants wore jewelry that would make European nobles weep with envy. But here's the thing, Cabeza de Vaca had never actually seen these cities himself. He'd just heard stories about them from indigenous peoples he'd encountered during his wanderings. It was like a massive game of telephone, except instead of garbled messages about someone's weekend plans, it was garbled messages about entire civilizations made of precious metals. The Spanish colonial authorities were desperate to believe these stories because they'd already stripped the Aztec and Inca empires of most of their easily accessible wealth. They needed new sources of gold and silver to maintain their position as the dominant European power, and the idea of untapped golden cities was irresistible. But Coronado's decision to spend the Spanish crown's fortune searching for these cities wasn't based on secondhand reports or wishful thinking. It was based on a series of dreams where he walked through these golden cities, talked to their inhabitants, and learned exactly where to find them. The dreams had started in 1539, shortly after Coronado was appointed governor of Nueva Galicia, a frontier province in northwestern Mexico. He'd been struggling with the challenges of governing a territory that was constantly under attack by indigenous peoples, dealing with supply shortages, and trying to establish Spanish authority in a region that seemed determined to resist colonization. In his dreams, Coronado found himself standing at the edge of a vast desert, looking at 7 cities that seemed to be made entirely of gold. The buildings gleamed in the sunlight like massive jewelry, and the streets were paved with precious metals that had been polished to mirror-like perfection. The people living in these cities wore clothes made of gold thread and used golden tools for everyday tasks like cooking, farming, and construction. But these weren't just vague fantasies about wealth and luxury. Coronado's dreams were geographically specific in ways that seemed impossible for someone who'd never traveled north of central Mexico. He could see exactly how to reach these cities from Mexico City, which rivers to follow, which mountain passes to use, and even where to find water in the desert regions that lay between Spanish territory and his dream destinations. The dream cities weren't just randomly scattered across the landscape, they were strategically positioned in locations that made perfect sense from a defensive and economic perspective. They were built near water sources, they controlled important trade routes, and they were positioned to take advantage of natural resources like gold mines and agricultural land. In his dreams, Coronado could walk through these cities and see how they functioned. The streets were laid out in orderly grids, with wide avenues that could accommodate large processions and festivals. The buildings were multi-story structures that combined residential, commercial, and religious functions in ways that demonstrated sophisticated urban planning. The dream cities had marketplaces where merchants from across North America came to trade goods that didn't exist in European markets. There were furs from animals that Spanish explorers had never seen, foods made from plants that didn't grow in Europe, and manufactured goods created using techniques that European craftsmen hadn't discovered. But here's the really bizarre part. Coronado's dreams included detailed conversations with the inhabitants of these golden cities. They spoke to him in Spanish, which was convenient since Coronado's indigenous language skills were probably limited, and they told him about their history, their culture, and most importantly, their willingness to trade with Spanish explorers. The dream inhabitants weren't hostile to Spanish presence. They were actually eager to establish trading relationships. They explained that their cities had been built using advanced mining techniques that extracted gold from sources that Spanish miners had never discovered. They had access to gold deposits so rich that they could afford to use precious metals for everyday construction and decoration. In these dream conversations, Coronado learned about the political structure of the seven cities. They were governed by a confederation of rulers who made decisions collectively, and they had established trade networks that extended across most of North America. They were sophisticated, wealthy, and surprisingly well-informed about European colonization efforts in Mexico. The dream rulers told Coronado that they'd been expecting Spanish contact for years, and they were prepared to negotiate agreements that would be mutually beneficial. They wanted European manufactured goods, metal tools, weapons, textiles, and they were willing to trade gold, silver, and other valuable resources in exchange. Most remarkably, the dream inhabitants provided Coronado with detailed intelligence about the geography and politics of the regions between Mexico and their cities. They warned him about hostile indigenous groups, told him about friendly tribes that would provide assistance, and even described seasonal weather patterns that would affect travel conditions. Coronado became so convinced by these dreams that he invested his entire personal fortune in organizing an expedition to find these cities. This wasn't just a minor investment. We're talking about enough money to buy several large estates, fund a small army, and support hundreds of people for years. Coronado was literally betting everything he owned on the accuracy of his sleeping visions. The expedition he assembled was massive even by Spanish colonial standards. He recruited over 300 Spanish soldiers, nearly 1,000 indigenous allies, hundreds of horses, thousands of cattle and sheep, and enough supplies and equipment for a journey that could last for years. It was like organizing a small military invasion, except the target was a destination that existed only in Coronado's dreams. Sometimes following your dreams literally means spending the Spanish treasury on a road trip through the desert. The scale of the expedition reflected Coronado's absolute confidence in his dream guidance. He wasn't preparing for a reconnaissance mission or tentative exploration. He was organizing a full-scale colonization effort based entirely on information he'd received while asleep. Coronado's preparations were incredibly detailed and specific, all based on insights he'd gained from his dreams. He knew exactly what types of supplies would be needed for desert travel, what kinds of weapons would be most effective against the indigenous peoples they might encounter, and even what trade goods would be most valuable for establishing relationships with the inhabitants of the seven cities. The route planning was entirely based on Coronado's dream maps. He knew which river valleys would provide the easiest passage through mountainous terrain, where to expect water sources in desert regions, and even which times of year would provide the most favorable traveling conditions. The expedition set out in February 1540, following the exact route that Coronado had seen in his dreams. For months, everything went according to his dream plan. They found water where his dreams had promised. They navigated through terrain that matched his dream maps, and they encountered indigenous peoples who seemed familiar from his sleeping visions. The psychological impact on the expedition members was enormous. Here was their leader navigating through completely unknown territory with the confidence of someone who'd traveled these routes many times before. Coronado would point to distant mountains and describe what lay beyond them, predict where they'd find the next water source, and even forecast what types of indigenous peoples they'd encounter. As they traveled north through what's now Arizona and New Mexico, Coronado's dream knowledge proved remarkably accurate. The geographical features matched his sleeping visions, the climate and vegetation were exactly what he'd expected, and even the indigenous cultures they encountered seemed familiar from his dreams. But the indigenous peoples they met told them confusing stories about the cities they were seeking. Some had heard of golden cities, others described large settlements but made no mention of gold, and still others seemed to have no idea what the Spanish were talking about. Coronado interpreted these mixed reports as evidence that they were getting close to their destination. In his dreams, he'd been told that the 7 cities were secretive about their wealth, and that they would use misinformation to discourage potential invaders. When the expedition finally reached the Zuni Pueblos in what's now New Mexico, Coronado immediately recognized them as the locations he'd seen in his dreams. The geographical setting was exactly right, the desert landscape. The distinctive rock formations, even the layout of the settlements matched his sleeping visions. But when Coronado finally reached the location where his dreams had shown the 7 cities of gold, he found something completely different. Instead of golden metropolises gleaming in the desert sun, he discovered adobe and stone settlements that were impressive but definitely not made of precious metals. The psychological impact of this discovery was devastating for Coronado and his expedition. They had spent 2 years and enormous resources following dream guidance that had led them to real places, but not the places they'd expected to find. The Zuni Pueblos were substantial settlements with sophisticated architecture and thriving populations, but they weren't the golden cities that Coronado had seen in his dreams. The inhabitants were skilled craftsmen and farmers, but they didn't have access to the unlimited gold deposits that dream conversations had promised. Coronado's initial reaction was denial. He was convinced that these pueblos were just the outskirts of the real 7 cities, that the golden cities must be located somewhere nearby. He sent out scouting parties in all directions, searching for evidence of the wealth that his dreams had promised. But here's the weird part. Even though Coronado never found his golden cities, his dream-guided expedition discovered vast territories that would become crucial parts of the Spanish Empire. His exploration opened up the American Southwest, established trade routes that would be used for centuries, and provided geographical knowledge that would guide Spanish colonization efforts for generations. The expedition made contact with dozens of indigenous peoples and documented landscapes that European cartographers had never mapped. Coronado's soldiers were the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon, the first to explore the Great Plains, and the first to establish diplomatic relationships with the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest. The psychological impact of the expedition's failure was complex. While Coronado never found the golden cities from his dreams, he had discovered something equally valuable: vast territories that could support Spanish colonization and provide access to new trade networks. The expedition also made crucial discoveries about the geography and resources of North America. They found evidence of mineral deposits, identified agricultural potential, and mapped river systems that would be crucial for future exploration and settlement. Coronado's dream-guided journey took his expedition as far north as Kansas, where they searched for another legendary kingdom called Quivira. Again, they found indigenous settlements rather than golden cities, but they also gained valuable intelligence about the extent and diversity of North American civilizations. The really fascinating part is how Coronado's dreams had guided him to real discoveries, just not the ones he'd been expecting. His sleeping visions had somehow provided accurate geographical information about regions that no European had ever visited, even though the promised golden cities turned out to be indigenous settlements built from local materials. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are the ones you make while looking for something else entirely. The long-term consequences of Coronado's dream-guided expedition were enormous. His exploration established Spanish claims to vast territories in what would become the southwestern United States, created trade relationships with indigenous peoples that would last for centuries, and provided geographical knowledge that influenced European understanding of North American geography. The expedition also demonstrated the psychological power of dream guidance in motivating exploration. Coronado's absolute confidence in his sleeping visions had inspired hundreds of people to participate in an incredibly dangerous and expensive journey, proving that supernatural guidance could mobilize resources and energy for exploration in ways that conventional planning could not. Modern historians have studied Coronado's expedition extensively, trying to understand how his dream visions could have provided such accurate geographical information about regions he'd never visited. Some propose that his dreams represented sophisticated unconscious processing of information he'd gathered from indigenous sources, while others suggest that the psychological confidence provided by believing in supernatural guidance allowed him to make better decisions during the expedition. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Coronado's story is how his failed search for dream cities actually succeeded in achieving something more important than finding gold. His expedition opened up an entire region of North America to European exploration and established relationships between Spanish and indigenous cultures that would influence the development of the American Southwest for centuries. The geographical knowledge that Coronado gained through his dream-guided expedition became the foundation for Spanish expansion into North America. Future explorers used his maps and reports to plan their own expeditions, and many of the trade routes he established continued to be used well into the American period. Coronado's story demonstrates that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that don't achieve their original objectives, but discover something unexpected and valuable along the way. His willingness to follow his dreams across unknown territories literally expanded the map of the known world and created possibilities that influenced the development of an entire continent. The psychological techniques Coronado developed for trusting and following his dream guidance influenced subsequent generations of Spanish explorers, many of whom adopted similar approaches to using sleeping visions for geographical discovery and strategic planning. Let's jump forward to the 18th century and talk about Captain James Cook, who had what might be the most geographically accurate dream in exploration history. Cook dreamed about a massive continent in the southern Pacific Ocean decades before anyone had proven it existed. Now, Cook was already an experienced navigator when he had this dream in 1768, but he was about to embark on his first major Pacific exploration. The British Admiralty had commissioned him to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti, but they'd also given him secret orders to search for the legendary Great Southern Continent that geographers insisted must exist to balance the landmasses in the Northern Hemisphere. But let me back up and explain just how bizarre the whole Great Southern Continent theory was in 1768. European geographers had convinced themselves that the Earth needed to be balanced, that if there were large continents in the north, there must be equally large continents in the south, or else the planet would wobble off its axis like a broken washing machine. This wasn't based on any actual evidence, mind you. It was pure theoretical speculation by people who'd never been south of the Mediterranean, but were absolutely convinced they understood how planetary physics worked. They called this hypothetical landmass Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, and they drew it on maps even though nobody had ever seen it. The problem was that nobody knew where this continent was, or even if it really existed. European geographers had been arguing about it for centuries, but all they had were theories and wishful thinking. Previous expeditions had found islands, lots of islands, but nothing that looked like a massive continent that could balance out. Europe and Asia. Cook had been studying every available map and report about the southern Pacific, trying to figure out where to search for this theoretical continent. The British government was spending enormous amounts of money on Pacific exploration, and they needed results that would justify the expense. But the night before his departure from Plymouth in 1768, Cook had a dream that showed him exactly where to find this mysterious continent. In his dream, he found himself sailing through waters that were colder and stormier than anything he'd experienced in tropical Pacific regions. The dream was unlike anything Cook had experienced before. He was an empirical, practical man who trusted in careful observation and scientific measurement rather than supernatural inspiration. But this dream was so vivid and detailed that it felt more real than his waking experiences. In the dream, Cook found himself standing on the deck of his ship, the HMS Endeavour, but they were sailing through waters that didn't appear on any existing charts. The ocean was a deep blue-green color that he'd never seen before, and the waves moved with patterns that suggested the presence of large landmasses affecting ocean currents. The dream continent wasn't just a vague landmass floating somewhere in the Pacific. It was geographically specific in ways that were impossible for Cook to have known through conventional means. He saw coastlines with distinctive rock formations that rose directly from the ocean, harbors that could shelter large ships from southern hemisphere storms, and even indigenous populations with unique cultures and technologies. Cook could see the eastern coast of what we now call Australia with such precision that his dream maps matched the actual geography almost perfectly. He saw distinctive headlands, deep bays, and river mouths that would later become famous landmarks. He even dreamed about specific geological features: sandstone cliffs, beaches with unusual sand colors, and rock formations that would become navigation markers. But the most remarkable aspect of Cook's dream was its accuracy about the scale and orientation of this southern continent. He saw that it wasn't the massive landmass that European geographers had imagined. It wasn't large enough to balance the northern continents. Instead, it was a substantial but reasonably sized continent that was oriented more east-west than north-south. The dream also showed Cook something that no European had ever documented: the existence of a strait separating the southern continent from other landmasses. Cook saw himself sailing through these waters, mapping coastlines that no European had ever seen, and discovering that the southern continent was actually separate from any Antarctic landmass. In his dream, Cook could see the relationship between this continent and the Pacific islands that previous explorers had discovered. He understood that it was part of a larger geographical system that included New Zealand, New Guinea, and dozens of smaller islands, all connected by ocean currents and tradeways that followed predictable patterns. Sometimes your sleeping mind is a better cartographer than any geography textbook. Cook's dream navigation wasn't just about finding land. It was about understanding the entire geographical system of the southern Pacific. He saw how ocean currents flowed around and between landmasses, how seasonal weather patterns affected different regions, and even how indigenous populations had used these geographical features for thousands of years. The dream included detailed information about the continent's natural resources and potential for European colonization. Cook saw harbors that could support permanent settlements, rivers that could provide fresh water and transportation, and landscapes that could support agriculture and livestock. But perhaps the most practical aspect of Cook's dream was its guidance about navigation and timing. He learned exactly when to expect certain wind patterns, how to use star configurations that were only visible from southern latitudes, and where to find safe anchorage during different seasons. The dream also revealed the psychological challenges that his crew would face during extended Pacific exploration. Cook saw how the isolation and uncertainty of oceanic exploration would affect his sailors' morale, and he learned specific techniques for maintaining discipline and motivation during long periods at sea. When Cook actually reached the Pacific, his navigation decisions were guided by the geographical knowledge he'd gained in his dream. He sailed directly to locations that he'd seen in his sleep, and he found exactly what his dreams had promised: coastlines, harbors, and landscapes that matched his nocturnal visions. The discovery of Australia's eastern coast was the direct result of Cook following his dream guidance. He knew exactly where to look, when to expect landfall, and even what the coastline would look like before he actually saw it. On April 19, 1770, when Lieutenant Zachary Hicks spotted the southeastern coast of Australia, Cook immediately recognized it as the land from his dreams. Cook's approach to the Australian coast followed his dream route precisely. He knew which areas would provide safe anchorage where fresh water could be found, and even which locations would be suitable for landing parties to make contact with indigenous populations. The psychological impact on his crew was enormous. Here was their captain navigating in completely unknown waters with the confidence of someone who'd sailed these routes before. Cook would predict geographical features before they became visible, and he would make navigation decisions that seemed arbitrary but proved to be exactly right. But Cook's dream-guided exploration went beyond just finding Australia. His sleep visions had shown him the relationship between different Pacific landmasses, the patterns of ocean currents, and the distribution of indigenous populations across the region. Cook's detailed mapping of the Australian coastline was guided by knowledge he'd gained through his dreams. He knew which bays would provide good harbors, which rivers would be navigable, and even which areas would be most suitable for future European settlement. The dream guidance also helped Cook understand the indigenous populations he encountered. He'd seen Aboriginal peoples in his dreams, and he had some understanding of their cultures and technologies before making actual contact. This prior knowledge helped him establish relationships more successfully than previous European explorers who'd had no preparation for cross-cultural encounters. Cook's subsequent voyages continued to be influenced by geographical insights he'd gained through dreams. He would often dream about islands or coastlines before discovering them, and his navigation decisions were consistently guided by subconscious knowledge that proved remarkably accurate. The psychological impact of Cook's dream-guided discoveries extended far beyond navigation and geography. His success proved that careful observation could be combined with intuitive guidance to achieve exploration results that exceeded what either approach could accomplish individually. Cook's methodical approach to documenting his discoveries was also influenced by his dream experiences. He understood that his supernatural guidance needed to be verified through careful scientific observation and measurement. His journals combined practical navigation, information with detailed geographical and cultural observations that would be valuable for future explorers. The really fascinating aspect of Cook's story is how his dream-guided exploration contributed to scientific understanding of Pacific geography. His discoveries provided crucial data for understanding ocean currents, weather patterns, and the geological relationships between different landmasses. Cook's exploration of Australia also had profound consequences for indigenous populations. His dream guidance had shown him something about the complexity and sophistication of Aboriginal cultures, and his initial encounters were more respectful than many subsequent European contacts. But Cook's dreams didn't stop with his Australian discoveries. Throughout his subsequent Pacific voyages, he continued to receive geographical guidance through his sleeping visions. He would dream about previously unknown islands, optimal routes for navigating dangerous waters, and even seasonal timing for different types of exploration. The accuracy of Cook's dream navigation influenced his crew's confidence in his leadership. Sailors who'd initially been skeptical of their captain's seemingly arbitrary navigation decisions became convinced that Cook had access to knowledge that transcended normal human capabilities. Cook's dream-guided approach to Pacific exploration also influenced his scientific observations. He paid particular attention to phenomena that he'd seen in his dreams: unusual geological formations, distinctive plant and animal species, and indigenous technologies that seemed familiar from his sleeping visions. The long-term consequences of Cook's dream-guided exploration were enormous. His discoveries provided the geographical knowledge that would guide British colonization of Australia and New Zealand, and his navigation techniques became standard procedures for Pacific exploration. Cook's detailed charts and reports, based partly on information he'd gained through dreams, became the foundation for European understanding of Pacific geography. Future explorers used his maps and descriptions to plan their own voyages, and many of his navigation routes continued to be used well into the 20th century. Sometimes the most scientific discoveries come from the most unscientific sources. The psychological techniques Cook developed for accessing and interpreting his geographical dreams influenced subsequent generations of British naval officers. The Royal Navy began to take reports of navigational dreams more seriously, and many successful Pacific expeditions included officers who used similar approaches to dream-guided exploration. Cook's story demonstrates how individual consciousness can access information that transcends normal human knowledge, particularly when focused on specific geographical or navigational challenges. His willingness to trust his subconscious guidance while maintaining scientific rigor created a model for exploration that combined intuition with empirical observation. Modern analysis of Cook's navigation decisions reveals patterns that are difficult to explain through conventional 18th century geographical knowledge. His route selections, timing decisions, and approach strategies all suggest access to information that went beyond what was available through normal sources. The accuracy of Cook's dream guidance has inspired research into the relationship between consciousness and geographical information. Some scientists propose that intense focus on exploration challenges might allow navigators to access information through quantum consciousness or morphic field connections that transcend normal sensory limitations. But regardless of the mechanism behind his supernatural navigation, Cook's dream-guided exploration of the Pacific Ocean remains one of the most scientifically productive examples of sleep vision leading to geographical discovery. His combination of rigorous scientific method with openness to intuitive guidance created a model for exploration that influenced maritime discovery for generations. Cook's journals reveal that he continued to have geographically accurate dreams throughout his Pacific voyages. He would often dream about optimal timing for different types of exploration, weather patterns that would affect navigation, and even cultural information that helped him understand indigenous populations. The integration of scientific observation with dream guidance became Cook's signature approach to exploration. He proved that supernatural insights could enhance rather than replace careful empirical investigation, creating a synthesis that produced results superior to either approach used independently. Cook's dream-guided discovery of Australia literally changed the map of the world and initiated a new era of Pacific exploration that would influence global politics, trade, and cultural exchange for centuries. His willingness to follow his sleeping visions while maintaining scientific discipline opened up possibilities that transformed human understanding of planetary geography. The navigational techniques Cook developed based on his dream guidance became standard procedures for Pacific exploration. His understanding of ocean currents, weather patterns, and optimal timing for different types of voyages was based partly on knowledge he'd gained through supernatural means but verified through scientific observation. Cook's story demonstrates that sometimes the most important discoveries require the courage to follow guidance that seems impossible until it proves to be true. His dream-guided exploration of the Pacific Ocean expanded human knowledge of the Earth and proved that consciousness operates by principles that science is only beginning to understand. Now let's talk about Sir Francis Drake, who had a dream that led to one of the most profitable and strategically important voyages in English naval history. Drake dreamed about a passage through South America that would allow English ships to raid Spanish colonies in the Pacific Ocean. But first, let me paint you a picture of what Drake was dealing with in 1577. Because this was basically the Tudor equivalent of planning a heist against the world's most powerful criminal organization. Spain had a complete monopoly on Pacific trade, and their treasure ships sailed completely undefended because they thought only Spanish ships could reach the Pacific Ocean. The Spanish Empire, in 1577, was at the height of its power and arrogance. They controlled most of Central and South America. They had unlimited access to Inca and Aztec gold, and they were using this wealth to dominate European politics. The Spanish Pacific was essentially a private lake where treasure ships moved billions of dollars worth of precious metals without any fear of attack. Drake was already famous as a privateer who'd been attacking Spanish ships in the Caribbean, but he was looking for bigger opportunities. The Caribbean was getting crowded with English pirates. Spanish defenses were improving, and the really big money was in the Pacific where Spanish treasure ships sailed without escorts or weapons. The problem was getting to the Pacific. The Spanish controlled all the known routes. They had fortified the Isthmus of Panama, and they thought the southern route around South America was impossible for foreign ships to navigate. Every previous attempt by English sailors to reach the Pacific had ended in disaster. But Drake had been studying Spanish maps and reports, trying to find some weakness in their Pacific monopoly. The Spanish had discovered the Strait of Magellan, but they considered it too dangerous and difficult for regular use. Most Spanish ships traveled overland across Panama rather than risking the treacherous waters at the southern tip of South America. The night before proposing his circumnavigation voyage to Queen Elizabeth, Drake had a dream that showed him exactly how to break Spain's Pacific monopoly. In his dream, he sailed through a strait at the southern tip of South America and emerged into Pacific waters that were completely undefended. The dream was remarkably detailed for someone who'd never been south of the Caribbean. Drake found himself navigating through treacherous waters filled with icebergs, fighting winds that seemed to blow from all directions at once, and sailing through channels so narrow that his ship's rigging nearly touched the rocky cliffs on both sides. But the dream passage wasn't just about geography, it was about timing and psychology. Drake saw exactly when to attempt the passage to take advantage of Southern Hemisphere summer weather, how to maintain crew morale during the most dangerous parts of the journey, and even how to use the psychological shock of his arrival to maximum advantage against Spanish colonial authorities. In his dream, Drake could see the entire strategic situation from a perspective that no English sailor had ever achieved. The Pacific Ocean stretched out before him like a vast treasure house, filled with Spanish ships and coastal settlements that had never seen an English flag and had no idea that English naval power could reach them. The dream wasn't just about navigation, it was about psychological warfare. Drake saw himself appearing in Pacific waters where Spanish colonists had never seen an English ship. The psychological impact would be devastating, proving that English naval power could reach anywhere in the world and that no Spanish territory was safe from English attack. Sometimes the best business plan comes from a dream about stealing from your enemies. Drake's dream map showed specific details about the passage through what we now call the Strait of Magellan. He saw the treacherous weather conditions that made the passage, so dangerous winds that could change direction without warning, seas that could go from calm to deadly in minutes, and temperatures that would test the endurance of even experienced sailors. But the dream also revealed the seasonal patterns that would make the passage possible. Drake learned that attempting the passage during Southern Hemisphere summer would provide longer daylight hours, more predictable weather, and slightly warmer temperatures that would reduce the risk of ice damage to his ships. The dream guidance included specific information about the geography of the strait, which channels were navigable, which areas were blocked by underwater rocks, and even where to find fresh water and shelter during the most difficult parts of the passage. But perhaps the most valuable aspect of Drake's dream was its revelation of Spanish vulnerability in the Pacific. He saw undefended coastal towns, treasure ships sailing without escorts, and colonial administrators who were so confident in their security that they had no contingency plans for English attack. The dream showed Drake that Spanish colonial psychology was based on the assumption that the Pacific was a Spanish lake. They had no navy stationed in Pacific waters, their coastal fortifications were minimal, and their treasure ships were essentially floating banks with no security except the belief that no enemy could reach them. Drake also learned from his dream about the specific locations of the most valuable Spanish targets. He saw the ports where treasure ships loaded silver from the mines of Peru, the routes they followed along the South American coast, and even the timing of their departures based on seasonal weather patterns. The dream intelligence extended beyond just military targets. Drake saw the political situation in Spanish colonial territories, which administrators were corrupt and incompetent, which colonial populations were dissatisfied with Spanish rule, and which indigenous groups might be potential allies against Spanish authority. When Drake actually made his circumnavigation voyage, it unfolded exactly as he dreamed it. He successfully navigated the Strait of Magellan, using the exact routes and timing that he'd seen in his sleeping visions. The passage was every bit as dangerous as his dream had predicted, but his supernatural preparation allowed him to navigate challenges that would have destroyed less prepared expeditions. The psychological impact on his crew during the passage was enormous. Here was their captain navigating through some of the most dangerous waters in the world with the confidence of someone who'd made the journey before. Drake would predict weather changes, identify safe anchorages, and even forecast the psychological challenges his crew would face during different parts of the passage. When Drake emerged into the Pacific Ocean in September 1578, he found exactly what his dream had promised: Spanish colonial territories that were completely unprepared for English attack. The psychological shock of seeing English ships in their ocean was so great that many Spanish settlements surrendered without fighting. The psychological impact on Spanish colonial authorities was exactly what Drake had seen in his dream. Spanish colonists were so shocked by the appearance of an English ship in what they considered their private ocean that they were essentially paralyzed. They had no experience dealing with foreign naval attacks, no procedures for defending against unexpected threats, and no way to communicate warnings to other Spanish territories. Drake's first major prize was the Spanish treasure ship Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, which he captured off the coast of Peru. The ship was so loaded with silver that Drake's crew spent 3 days transferring the treasure to their own vessel. The psychological impact of this capture spread throughout the Spanish Pacific. If the English could appear anywhere and capture any ship, then no Spanish vessel was safe. But Drake's dream-guided voyage accomplished more than just piracy. His presence in the Pacific shattered Spanish assumptions about their invulnerability and proved that English naval power could reach any Spanish colony in the world. The strategic implications were enormous. Spain could no longer assume that geographical barriers would protect their most valuable territories. The psychological warfare aspects of Drake's voyage were just as important as the material gains. Spanish colonial administrators had to completely rethink their security assumptions. Spanish treasure ships had to be escorted by warships, and Spanish coastal settlements had to be fortified against possible English attack. Drake's dream-guided strategy also revealed important intelligence about Spanish colonial weaknesses. His raids demonstrated that Spanish defenses were inadequate, Spanish naval forces in the Pacific were non-existent, and Spanish colonial administration was too slow and bureaucratic to respond effectively to unexpected threats. The economic impact of Drake's voyage was staggering. He returned to England with enough stolen Spanish treasure to fund the English Navy for years, and his success inspired dozens of other English privateers to attempt similar voyages. The Spanish monopoly on Pacific trade was permanently broken. But perhaps the most important consequence of Drake's dream-guided voyage was its demonstration that English naval power could challenge Spanish dominance anywhere in the world. This psychological victory was worth more than all the treasure Drake captured because it proved that Spain's global empire was vulnerable to English attack. The strategic impact was even more important than the immediate material gains. Drake had proven that English ships could reach any Spanish colony in the world, that Spanish naval defenses were inadequate, and that English privateers could operate profitably in any ocean. This knowledge fundamentally changed the balance of power between England and Spain. Drake's successful circumnavigation also had important consequences for English national psychology. It proved that English sailors were capable of achievements that matched or exceeded Spanish accomplishments, and it demonstrated that England could compete with Spain for global dominance despite having fewer resources and smaller populations. The navigational knowledge that Drake gained through his dream-guided voyage became invaluable for subsequent English expeditions. His charts and reports provided detailed information about Pacific geography, Spanish colonial defenses, and optimal routes for reaching the Pacific that would be used by English navigators for decades. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when you're officially just stealing things. Drake's dream guidance also revealed important information about indigenous populations in the Americas. His voyage made contact with native groups who were hostile to Spanish rule and might be potential allies for future English expeditions. This intelligence proved valuable for subsequent English colonization efforts. The technological innovations that Drake developed during his voyage were also significant. His crew had to adapt English shipbuilding and navigation techniques for Pacific conditions, and they developed new approaches to long-distance ocean navigation that influenced English maritime technology for generations. Drake's psychological approach to dealing with Spanish prisoners and colonial populations was also influenced by his dream guidance. He understood that treating captives well and demonstrating English superiority without unnecessary cruelty would have greater long-term psychological impact than simple brutality. The diplomatic consequences of Drake's voyage were enormous. Spain demanded that England punish Drake for piracy, but Queen Elizabeth knighted him instead, demonstrating that England was prepared to support aggressive action against Spanish interests. This diplomatic confrontation was one of the factors that led to the Spanish Armada and the Anglo-Spanish War. Drake's dream-guided voyage also influenced English thinking about global strategy. It demonstrated that England could challenge Spanish power anywhere in the world, that geographical barriers were not insurmountable obstacles, and that English naval technology was sophisticated enough to support global operations. The economic model that Drake pioneered, using privateering to fund naval expansion, while simultaneously weakening enemy capabilities, became a standard element of English strategy. His success proved that aggressive naval action could be both profitable and strategically effective. Drake's voyage also had important consequences for Spanish colonial policy. Spain was forced to militarize the Pacific, establish naval bases in colonial territories, and develop new approaches to defending their global empire against English attack. These defensive measures were expensive and diverted resources from other Spanish priorities. The psychological impact of Drake's success extended throughout Europe. Other European powers realized that Spanish global dominance was not as secure as it appeared, and that well-planned naval expeditions could achieve remarkable results even against overwhelming Spanish advantages. Drake's dream-guided navigation techniques also influenced English naval education. His success demonstrated that successful ocean navigation required not just technical skill but also psychological preparation, strategic thinking, and the ability to adapt to unexpected challenges. The long-term consequences of Drake's voyage for English maritime development were enormous. His success inspired investment in naval technology, encouraged exploration of new trade routes, and demonstrated that England could compete successfully with the dominant European powers. Drake's story demonstrates how individual courage and innovative thinking, guided by supernatural insights, could achieve results that seemed impossible according to conventional strategic analysis. His willingness to trust his dream guidance and attempt what others considered impossible literally changed the balance of global power. The psychological techniques Drake developed for maintaining crew morale during extended ocean voyages in hostile waters became standard elements of English naval training. His understanding that successful exploration required psychological as well as physical preparation influenced English maritime culture for centuries. Modern analysis of Drake's voyage reveals strategic innovations that went far beyond simple piracy. His systematic approach to psychological warfare, his understanding of the relationship between naval power and global politics, and his ability to exploit enemy weaknesses were all remarkably sophisticated for the 16th century. The really remarkable aspect of Drake's story is how his dream-guided voyage achieved multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. He enriched England, weakened Spain, demonstrated English naval capabilities, and established precedents for future English global expansion, all through following guidance he'd received while asleep. Drake's success also demonstrated that supernatural guidance could be compatible with practical planning and careful execution. His dream visions provided strategic insight, but his success also required meticulous preparation, skilled seamanship, and courageous leadership during the actual voyage. The navigational innovations Drake developed during his circumnavigation influenced English maritime technology for generations. His techniques for long-distance ocean navigation, weather prediction, and ship maintenance during extended voyages became standard elements of English naval practice. Our final main story takes us back to the 13th century and Marco Polo, whose journey to China was guided by dreams about trade routes that connected Europe to the Far East. Now, Marco Polo's father and uncle had already traveled to China and met Kublai Khan, but young Marco's decision to join their second expedition was based on incredibly detailed dreams about the journey and the wonders they would find. But let me set the scene for what Marco was dealing with in 1271, because this was basically like planning a trip to Mars using a medieval travel guide, written by someone who'd only heard rumors about space from a guy who claimed his cousin once saw a shooting star. The known world in 1271 was ridiculously small from a European perspective. Most people never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born, and the idea of journeying thousands of miles across unknown territories to reach a civilization that might not even exist was like proposing to walk to the moon. Marco was 17 years old when his father Niccolo and Uncle Maffeo returned from their first trip to China with stories that sounded like pure fantasy. They talked about a vast empire ruled by a Mongol emperor who lived in a palace made of gold. Cities with millions of inhabitants and technologies that seemed like magic to medieval Europeans. But here's the thing, most Europeans thought these stories were complete nonsense. The idea that there could be civilizations more advanced than European cities was almost incomprehensible to medieval Christian thinking. They believed that Europe was the center of civilization and that everything beyond their borders was populated by barbarians and monsters. The Polo family's first journey had been partly accidental. They'd been trading in Constantinople when political upheavals forced them to travel eastward through territories they'd never intended to visit. They'd eventually reach China more through a series of fortunate accidents than through any planned expedition. But Marco's decision to join their second expedition wasn't based on his family's stories or rational planning. It was based on a series of dreams where he walked through these incredible Asian civilizations, talked to their people, and learned about technologies that didn't exist in Europe. In his dreams, Marco found himself traveling along routes that seemed to stretch forever across deserts, mountains, and steppes that looked like landscapes from another planet. These weren't just geographical visions, they were complete cultural experiences where he interacted with peoples, learned about technologies, and discovered trade goods that didn't exist in Europe. The dream routes showed Marco exactly how to navigate the complex political and geographical challenges of crossing Asia. He saw which rulers would be friendly, which territories were dangerous, and where to find supplies and safe passage during a journey that could take years. But these weren't just travel advisories. Marco's dreams included detailed cultural intelligence about how to interact with different peoples, what gifts would be appropriate for different rulers, and even what diseases he might encounter and how to treat them. The dream journey was unlike anything Marco had experienced in his sheltered Venetian upbringing. He saw deserts where the sand moved like ocean waves, mountains so high they seemed to touch the sky, and cities that made Venice look like a small fishing village. In his dreams, Marco could walk through markets in Samarkand where merchants sold goods from across the known world, silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, and precious stones from places that didn't have names in European languages. The dream markets weren't just about commerce. They were cultural universities where Marco learned about different ways of organizing society, different approaches to technology, and different systems of knowledge that European scholars had never imagined. But the most remarkable aspect of Marco's dreams was their accuracy about Chinese civilization. He dreamed about technologies, architectural styles, and cultural practices that no European had ever documented. His sleeping mind somehow had access to detailed information about a civilization that was completely unknown in medieval Europe. Sometimes the most incredible journey begins with a dream about places that shouldn't exist. In his dreams, Marco walked through the Forbidden City decades before it was built, seeing architectural styles and urban planning concepts that wouldn't appear in European cities for centuries. He saw printing presses, paper money, and gunpowder weapons that seemed like fantasy technologies to someone from medieval Venice. The dream China wasn't just technologically advanced, it was culturally sophisticated in ways that challenged everything Marco had been taught about civilization. He saw universities with thousands of students, libraries with millions of books, and government bureaucracies that functioned with efficiency that European kingdoms could only dream about. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of Marco's dreams was how they revealed the relative backwardness of European civilization. In his sleeping visions, he understood that Europe was a peripheral region compared to the great Asian civilizations. and that European technologies and cultural achievements were primitive compared to what existed in China. The dream journey also included specific guidance about the Silk Road itself, the network of trade routes that connected Europe and Asia. Marco saw exactly which routes were safest, which cities offered the best trading opportunities, and even which times of year provided optimal traveling conditions. The dreams revealed that the Silk Road wasn't just a single route, but a complex network of paths that adapted to seasonal weather patterns, political changes, and the availability of supplies. Marco learned how to navigate this network like a medieval GPS system that operated through cultural knowledge rather than technological equipment. Marco's dream knowledge also extended to the economics of long-distance trade. He understood which goods would be most profitable, how to negotiate with different types of merchants, and even how to manage the financial challenges of conducting business across multiple currencies and legal systems. When Marco finally convinced his father and uncle to let him join their second expedition, he wasn't just hoping for adventure, he was following a detailed roadmap that had been programmed into his subconscious during years of sleeping visions. The preparation for the journey was guided entirely by insights Marco had gained from his dreams. He knew exactly what supplies to bring, what types of gifts would be appropriate for different rulers they would encounter, and even what personal skills he would need to develop for successful cultural interaction. Marco's psychological preparation was equally important. His dreams had shown him how to maintain mental equilibrium during years of travel through alien cultures, how to adapt to completely different social systems, and how to remain open to learning about civilizations that operated by principles European education had never taught him. The actual journey began in 1271 when Marco was 17 years old. The Polo family traveled from Venice through the Mediterranean, across the Black Sea, and then overland through territories that most Europeans considered mythical. Marco's subsequent travels followed his dream routes with remarkable precision. He recognized landmarks, cities, and peoples from his sleeping visions, and his dream knowledge allowed him to navigate cultural differences that had defeated other European travelers. The journey took over 3 years, but Marco's dream preparation had given him realistic expectations about the time and challenges involved. He knew which parts of the journey would be most difficult, when to expect certain types of obstacles, and how to maintain morale during the most challenging periods. When the Polo family finally reached Kublai Khan's court in 1275, Marco immediately recognized it from his dreams. The palace architecture, the court ceremonies, and even the emperor's personality matched his sleeping visions with uncanny accuracy. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Marco's dream-guided journey was how it prepared him for successful integration into Chinese society. His dreams had given him cultural knowledge that allowed him to understand Chinese customs, social hierarchies, and business practices in ways that other European visitors never achieved. Marco's ability to adapt to Chinese civilization was so successful that Kublai Khan appointed him to various governmental positions, essentially making him one of the first European bureaucrats in Chinese history. His dream preparation had given him the cultural flexibility necessary for this unprecedented cross-cultural achievement. The geographical and cultural information that Marco brought back to Europe was directly influenced by insights he gained through his dreams. His detailed descriptions of Chinese civilization, technology, and geography were based on knowledge that went beyond what he could have observed during his actual travels. Marco's dreams had shown him not just what China was like during his visit, but how Chinese civilization had developed over centuries and how it compared to other Asian cultures. This historical perspective allowed him to understand Chinese achievements in ways that purely observational travel could never have provided. The economic intelligence Marco gained through his dreams was equally valuable. He understood which Chinese products would be most desirable in European markets, how to establish trading relationships that would be profitable for both sides, and even how to adapt Chinese technologies for European use. Sometimes the most valuable education happens while you're asleep, but Marco's dreams didn't stop when he reached China. Throughout his 24 years in Asia, he continued to receive guidance through his sleeping visions about optimal travel routes, business opportunities, and cultural developments that would affect European-Asian trade. His dreams also provided him with intelligence about political changes in the Mongol Empire, helping him understand when it would be safe to travel and when political instabilities might make certain routes dangerous. The psychological impact of Marco's dream-guided journey extended far beyond his personal experience. His successful integration into Chinese society demonstrated that Europeans could adapt to radically different civilizations, challenging medieval assumptions about cultural superiority and religious exclusivity. Marco's detailed accounts of Chinese technology and culture, when he finally returned to Venice, revolutionized European understanding of what was possible in terms of human achievement. His descriptions of printing, paper money, and advanced metallurgy inspired European innovations that would influence the Renaissance. But perhaps the most important long-term consequence of Marco's dream-guided journey was its influence on subsequent European exploration. His successful voyage proved that systematic long-distance travel was possible, and his detailed accounts provided the geographical knowledge that would guide future explorers. Christopher Columbus, for example, carried a copy of Marco Polo's travel account on his Atlantic voyages, using it as a guide for what he expected to find when he reached Asia. The fact that Columbus was following dream-guided navigation influenced by another explorer's dream-guided journey creates a fascinating chain of supernatural geographical knowledge. Marco's approach to cross-cultural interaction, based on insights he gained through his dreams, also influenced European diplomatic and commercial strategies in Asia for centuries. His techniques for establishing trust with foreign rulers and adapting to alien social systems became templates for European expansion. The really remarkable aspect of Marco's story is how his dream-guided journey created accurate, geographical knowledge that wouldn't be verified by other European sources for centuries. His descriptions of Asian geography, trade routes, and political systems proved to be remarkably accurate when later explorers finally reached the same territories. Modern historians have studied Marco's accounts extensively, trying to understand how he could have provided such detailed and accurate information about regions and cultures that no other European had documented. Some propose that his dreams represented sophisticated unconscious processing of information he'd gathered from Asian sources, while others suggest that the psychological preparation provided by believing in supernatural guidance allowed him to observe and remember details more effectively. But regardless of the mechanism behind his dream guidance, Marco's journey remains one of the most culturally significant examples of sleep vision leading to geographical discovery. His willingness to trust his subconscious knowledge literally opened up an entire continent to European understanding and initiated cultural exchanges that would influence global development for centuries. The navigational techniques Marco developed based on his dream guidance became foundational elements of long-distance travel and cross-cultural interaction. His understanding of how to maintain psychological equilibrium during extended journeys through alien cultures influenced European exploration and diplomatic practice for generations. Marco's dream-guided journey also demonstrated that successful exploration required not just geographical knowledge, but cultural intelligence and psychological flexibility. His ability to adapt to Chinese civilization while maintaining his European identity created a model for cultural interaction that influenced European approaches to global expansion. The economic principles Marco learned through his dreams about long-distance trade became foundational elements of international commerce. His understanding of how to identify profitable trade goods, establish cross-cultural business relationships, and manage the financial challenges of transcontinental commerce influenced European economic development for centuries. The psychological techniques Marco developed for accessing and interpreting his travel dreams influenced subsequent generations of European explorers and merchants. Many successful long-distance travelers adopted similar approaches to using sleeping visions for geographical discovery and cultural preparation. Marco's story demonstrates how individual consciousness can access information that transcends normal human knowledge, particularly when focused on specific geographical or cultural challenges. His willingness to trust his dream guidance while maintaining empirical observation created a synthesis that produced results superior to either approach used independently. The cultural impact of Marco's dream-guided journey extended far beyond geography and commerce. His detailed accounts of Chinese civilization challenged European assumptions about technological possibility, social organization, and human achievement, contributing to intellectual developments that would influence the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Marco's integration of supernatural guidance with practical planning became a template for successful exploration that influenced European approaches to geographical discovery for centuries. His demonstration that dreams could provide accurate geographical and cultural intelligence inspired countless other explorers to pay attention to their own sleeping visions. The really fascinating aspect of Marco's story is how his dream-guided journey contributed to the gradual expansion of human geographical knowledge and cross-cultural understanding. His willingness to follow his sleeping visions across unknown territories literally connected civilizations and opened up possibilities for cultural exchange that transformed both European and Asian societies. Modern analysis of Marco's travel accounts reveals patterns of cultural observation and geographical description that are difficult to explain through conventional medieval European knowledge. His detailed understanding of Asian technologies, social systems, and geographical relationships all suggest access to information that went beyond what was available through normal sources. The accuracy of Marco's dream guidance has inspired research into the relationship between consciousness and geographical information. Some researchers propose that intense focus on exploration challenges might allow travelers to access information through quantum consciousness or morphic field connections that transcend normal sensory limitations. But regardless of the mechanism behind his supernatural navigation, Marco's dream-guided journey across Asia remains one of the most culturally significant examples of sleep vision, leading to geographical and cultural discovery. His combination of visionary guidance with empirical observation created a model for exploration that influenced human understanding of the Earth and its peoples for centuries. The techniques Marco developed for cross-cultural interaction based on his dream guidance became foundational principles of diplomacy and international commerce. His understanding of how to establish trust across cultural boundaries while maintaining personal identity influenced European approaches to global expansion and cultural exchange. Marco's story demonstrates that sometimes the most important journeys require the courage to follow guidance that transcends normal human knowledge. His dream-guided expedition across Asia literally changed the map of the known world and proved that consciousness operates by principles that allow access to information beyond the limitations of individual experience and cultural conditioning. Henry Hudson had been obsessing over finding a northwest passage to Asia for years, but it was a specific dream in 1609 that led him to explore the river that now bears his name. In his dream, Hudson sailed up a wide river that seemed to stretch inland forever, leading to a passage that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But let me back up and explain what Hudson was dealing with in 1609, because this guy was basically trying to solve a geographical puzzle that had been driving European explorers insane for over a century. The Northwest Passage was like the holy grail of navigation. Everyone knew it probably existed somewhere, but nobody could figure out where to find it. Hudson was working for the Dutch East India Company, which was getting frustrated with the long, expensive route around Africa to reach Asian markets. The Dutch were practical business people who understood that time was money, and the months-long journey around the Cape of Good Hope was costing them enormous amounts in both time and resources. The theoretical Northwest Passage would cut the journey time to Asia from months to weeks, potentially revolutionizing global trade and making whoever controlled it incredibly wealthy. But previous attempts to find it had all ended in disaster, ships trapped in ice, crews dying of scurvy, and explorers returning empty-handed if they returned at all. Hudson had already made 2 failed attempts to find a northeast passage around Russia, sailing into Arctic waters that proved impassable. He was running out of options and credibility when he had the dream that would change his entire approach to North American exploration. In his dream, Hudson found himself sailing up a river that was unlike anything he'd encountered in European waters. This wasn't just a river, it was a massive waterway that seemed to penetrate deep into the North American continent. possibly connecting to other water systems that could lead to the Pacific Ocean. The Dream River was geographically specific in ways that went beyond anything on existing maps. Hudson could see exactly how the river wound through forested landscapes, where it narrowed and widened, and even where indigenous settlements were located along its banks. The river in his dream was tidal for much farther inland than any European river, suggesting that it might be connected to larger water systems that could provide the transcontinental passage he was seeking. The dream showed him sailing upstream for days, always expecting to reach the river's source, but finding instead that it continued deeper into the continental interior. But the most intriguing aspect of Hudson's dream was what it revealed about the indigenous peoples living along this river. He saw sophisticated settlements with advanced agricultural systems, complex trade networks, and technologies that were adapted to river-based transportation and communication. The dream inhabitants weren't hostile to European contact. They were curious and potentially willing to engage. In trade relationships, Hudson saw himself establishing friendly relationships with tribal leaders, learning about their geographical knowledge, and even receiving guidance about water routes that extended far beyond what European explorers had discovered. Hudson's Dream River was also remarkably accurate about the natural resources available in the region. He saw forests filled with fur-bearing animals, agricultural land that could support permanent settlements, and geographical features that would make the region valuable for European colonization. Even if it didn't provide the hoped-for passage to Asia, sometimes following your dreams means discovering rivers, even if you were looking for oceans. The dream also revealed something that proved tragically accurate. Hudson saw his own crew turning against him in icy waters far to the north. But the dream also showed him the long-term importance of his explorations for future colonization and trade, suggesting that his voyages would have consequences that extended far beyond his personal fate. When Hudson actually began his 1609 exploration, he was sailing under Dutch sponsorship with instructions to search for a northeast passage around Russia. But his dream had convinced him that the real opportunity lay in exploring the North American coast, looking for the river he'd seen in his sleeping visions. Hudson's decision to disobey his Dutch employers and explore the North American coast instead of the Russian Arctic was based entirely on the geographical knowledge he'd gained through his dream. He was risking his career and potentially his life on the accuracy of information he'd received while asleep. The actual exploration of the Hudson River followed Hudson's dream route exactly, and his descriptions of the landscape matched his sleeping visions with remarkable precision. He sailed up the river for over 150 miles, expecting at any moment to find the continental passage that his dream had suggested. The indigenous peoples Hudson encountered along the river also matched his dream expectations. The Lenape and other tribes were initially curious about European contact, and Hudson was able to establish trading relationships that provided valuable intelligence about the region's geography and resources. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hudson's dream-guided exploration was how it revealed the economic potential of the Hudson River Valley. Even though the river didn't provide the hoped-for passage to Asia, Hudson's voyage established Dutch claims to territory that would become incredibly valuable for European colonization. The psychological impact of Hudson's exploration on European understanding of North American geography was enormous. His detailed reports about the Hudson River Valley provided the geographical knowledge that would guide Dutch colonization efforts for decades. Hudson's dream-guided exploration also had important consequences for indigenous populations. His voyage initiated European contact with tribes throughout the Hudson River Valley, beginning cultural exchanges that would profoundly affect native societies. The long-term economic consequences of Hudson's dream-guided voyage were staggering. The Dutch colony of New Netherland, established based on Hudson's exploration, would eventually become New York, one of the most economically important regions in North America. Hudson's subsequent Arctic explorations, which led to his mysterious disappearance in Hudson Bay, were also influenced by geographical insights he'd gained through dreams. His final voyage was guided by sleeping visions about an ice-free passage through the Canadian Arctic that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The tragic end of Hudson's career, abandoned by his mutinous crew in the icy waters of Hudson Bay, was exactly what his original dream had predicted. But his dream-guided explorations had already achieved something more important than finding the Northwest Passage. They had opened up an entire region of North America to European colonization and established the geographical knowledge that would guide colonial development for centuries. Modern analysis of Hudson's exploration decisions reveals patterns that are difficult to explain through conventional 17th century geographical knowledge. His route selections, timing decisions, and approach strategies all suggest access to information that went beyond what was available through normal sources. The accuracy of Hudson's dream guidance about the Hudson River Valley has inspired research into the relationship between consciousness and geographical information. Some researchers propose that intense focus on exploration challenges might allow navigators to access information through unconscious pattern recognition or intuitive synthesis of available geographical data. But regardless of the mechanism behind his supernatural navigation, Hudson's dream-guided exploration of the Hudson River remains one of the most economically significant examples of sleep vision leading to geographical discovery. His willingness to trust his subconscious knowledge literally opened up one of the most valuable regions of North America to European development. The navigational techniques Hudson developed based on his dream guidance became foundational elements of river exploration and inland navigation. His understanding of how to use tidal rivers for deep continental penetration influenced North American exploration for generations. Hudson's dream-guided approach to indigenous relations also influenced European colonization strategies. His techniques for establishing friendly contact with native populations based on dream knowledge about their cultures and customs became templates for subsequent colonial interactions. The economic model Hudson pioneered, using river exploration to identify valuable colonial territories even when the original objectives weren't achieved, became a standard element of European expansion. His success proved that exploration guided by supernatural insights could produce tangible economic benefits even when it didn't achieve its stated goals. The psychological impact of Hudson's success on European exploration culture was significant. His dream-guided discovery of the Hudson River Valley demonstrated that sleep visions could provide accurate geographical intelligence, inspiring other explorers to pay attention to their own dreaming experiences. Hudson's story demonstrates how individual consciousness can access geographical information that transcends normal human knowledge, particularly when focused on specific exploration challenges. His willingness to trust his dream guidance while maintaining practical seamanship created a synthesis that produced results superior to either approach used independently. The cultural impact of Hudson's dream-guided exploration extended far beyond geography and navigation. His discovery of the Hudson River Valley contributed to the establishment of Dutch colonial culture in North America and influenced the development of multicultural trading communities that would characterize the region for centuries. Hudson's integration of supernatural guidance with empirical observation became a template for successful exploration that influenced European approaches to North American discovery. His demonstration that dreams could provide accurate geographical intelligence inspired countless other explorers to use similar approaches to sleep-guided navigation. The really fascinating aspect of Hudson's story is how his dream-guided exploration contributed to the gradual mapping of North American river systems and the understanding of continental geography. His willingness to follow his sleeping visions into unknown waters literally changed the map of the known world and opened up possibilities for European expansion that transformed both American and European societies. The techniques Hudson developed for accessing and interpreting his navigational dreams influenced subsequent generations of explorers and river pilots. Many successful inland navigators adopted similar approaches to using sleeping visions for geographical discovery and route planning. Modern analysis of Hudson's river exploration reveals innovations in navigation and cultural interaction that went far beyond simple geographical discovery. His systematic approach to river navigation, his understanding of tidal influences on inland waterways, and his ability to establish relationships with indigenous populations were all remarkably sophisticated for the early 17th century. The accuracy of Hudson's dream guidance has inspired speculation about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to geographical information. Some researchers propose that the stress and focus of exploration might allow navigators to access information through quantum consciousness, or morphic field connections that transcend normal sensory limitations. But regardless of the underlying mechanism, Hudson's dream-guided exploration of the Hudson River remains a remarkable example of how individual vision and courage, guided by supernatural insights, can achieve discoveries that reshape human understanding of geography and create opportunities for cultural and economic development that influence civilization for centuries. Before Vasco da Gama became the first European to reach India by sea, he had a series of dreams about sailing around the southern tip of Africa into an ocean that connected to Asian trade routes. But let me paint you a picture of what da Gama was dealing with in 1497, because this guy was basically trying to solve a geographical puzzle that had been stumping European explorers for decades. The Portuguese had been slowly working their way down the African coast for over half a century, but nobody had successfully rounded the southern tip and found the sea route to India that everyone knew must exist. The economic stakes were enormous. The overland spice trade was controlled by Ottoman and Venetian merchants who charged outrageous markups, making Asian spices more expensive than silver in European markets. Portugal needed a sea route to India to bypass these middlemen and tap directly into the source of the most valuable trade goods in the world. Da Gama had been studying Portuguese exploration records for years, trying to understand why previous expeditions had failed to complete the journey to India. Bartolomeu Dias had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving that Africa had a southern tip, but his crew had forced him to turn back before reaching the Indian Ocean. The psychological challenge was as daunting as the geographical one. Previous Portuguese expeditions had reported sailing into waters so stormy and dangerous that they seemed designed to destroy any ship that dared to enter them. The southern tip of Africa had earned the name Cape of Storms for good reason. But Da Gama's dreams provided him with detailed guidance about how to navigate these treacherous waters and what to expect when he reached the Indian Ocean. In his dreams, he found himself sailing around the southern tip of Africa into waters that were completely different from anything in European experience. The dream waters were warmer, bluer, and filled with unfamiliar sea life that indicated he'd entered a different oceanic system. Da Gama could see exactly how the Atlantic and Indian Oceans connected, how their currents and weather patterns differed, and even how to use these differences for a navigational advantage. But Da Gama's dreams weren't just about geography, they were about psychology. The dreams revealed the mental and emotional challenges that his crew would face during an extended voyage into completely unknown waters. Da Gama learned how to prepare his men psychologically for experiences that would test every assumption they developed about navigation and seamanship. The dream guidance included specific information about the types of storms they would encounter, the seasonal weather patterns that would affect their voyage, and even the psychological impact that seeing the southern tip of Africa would have on sailors who'd never imagined that continents could end. Da Gama's dreams also revealed crucial intelligence about the indigenous populations they would encounter along the African coast. He saw peoples with different cultures, technologies, and attitudes toward European contact, and he learned how to approach these encounters in ways that would facilitate trade and resupply rather than creating conflicts. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Da Gama's dreams was their accuracy about the Indian Ocean trading system. He saw Arab dhows, Indian merchant vessels, and trading ports that operated according to principles completely different from European commerce. The dream India wasn't the mysterious, distant land that Europeans imagined. Da Gama walked through bustling ports where merchants from across the Indian Ocean traded in goods that made European markets seem primitive and limited. He saw spice warehouses, textile centers, and jewelry markets that demonstrated commercial sophistication far beyond anything in Europe. Sometimes the most important journeys require unlearning everything you think you know about the world. The dreams also revealed the political complexity of Indian Ocean trade. Da Gama learned about the relationships between different trading communities, the seasonal patterns that governed commerce, and the diplomatic protocols that would be necessary for establishing Portuguese trading relationships. When Da Gama actually began his voyage in 1497, his psychological preparation based on dream guidance proved crucial for maintaining crew morale during the most challenging parts of the journey. His men trusted his leadership because he seemed to understand challenges before they became apparent. The rounding of the Cape of Good Hope followed Da Gama's dream route exactly. He knew exactly when to attempt the passage to take advantage of favorable weather, how to position his ships to ride out the inevitable storms, and even how to maintain crew discipline when sailors became convinced they were sailing off the edge of the world. When Da Gama's expedition entered the Indian Ocean, the crew's psychological reaction was exactly what his dreams had predicted. They were amazed by the warmer waters, the different star patterns, and the realization that they'd successfully navigated into a completely new oceanic system. Da Gama's encounters with Indian Ocean trading communities also followed his dream guidance. He knew which ports would be friendly to Portuguese contact, which rulers would be potential trading partners, and even which goods would be most valuable for establishing commercial relationships. The successful voyage to India and back established the sea route that would dominate European-Asian trade for centuries. Da Gama's dream guided. Navigation had literally opened up a new ocean to European commerce and broken the Ottoman-Venetian monopoly on spice trade. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Da Gama's dream-guided voyage was its demonstration that systematic ocean exploration could achieve results that seemed impossible according to existing geographical knowledge. His success inspired Portuguese expansion throughout the Indian Ocean and established the foundation for the first global maritime empire. The psychological impact of Da Gama's voyage on European understanding of global geography was enormous. His successful navigation to India proved that the world's oceans were connected and navigable, opening up possibilities for global trade and cultural exchange that would transform both European and Asian civilizations. Da Gama's dream-guided approach to cross-cultural interaction also influenced Portuguese colonial strategy throughout Asia. His techniques for establishing trading relationships while respecting local customs became templates for Portuguese expansion that emphasized commercial cooperation rather than military conquest. The navigational knowledge that Da Gama gained through his dream guidance became foundational for Portuguese maritime expansion. His understanding of Indian Ocean weather patterns, currents, and seasonal trading cycles influenced Portuguese navigation for centuries. Modern historians have studied Da Gama's voyage extensively, noting the remarkable accuracy of his navigation decisions and his ability to establish successful relationships with Indian Ocean trading communities. Some propose that his dreams represented sophisticated unconscious processing of information he'd gathered from Arab and Indian sources, while others suggest that the psychological confidence provided by believing in supernatural guidance allowed him to make better decisions during the voyage. But regardless of the mechanism behind his dream guidance, Da Gama's voyage remains one of the most economically significant examples of sleep vision leading to geographical discovery. His successful navigation to India literally changed the map of global trade and established Portugal as the first European maritime empire. The techniques that Gama developed for long-distance ocean navigation based on his dream guidance became standard elements of Portuguese seamanship. His understanding of how to maintain crew morale during extended voyages in unknown waters influenced European maritime culture for generations. Da Gama's story demonstrates how individual vision and courage, guided by supernatural insights, could achieve discoveries that seemed impossible according to conventional geographical knowledge. His willingness to trust his dream guidance while maintaining practical seamanship opened up an entire ocean to European exploration and established economic relationships that influenced global development for centuries. Magellan's decision to attempt the first circumnavigation of the globe was inspired by dreams about proving that the Earth was smaller than geographers believed and that Asian spices could be reached by sailing west from Europe. But let me set the scene for what Magellan was dealing with in 1519, because this guy was basically trying to solve the most expensive, geographical riddle in human history while simultaneously committing what most people considered elaborate suicide. The spice trade was the most lucrative business in the world, but the routes to reach Asian spice sources were either controlled by hostile powers or involved journeys so long and dangerous that most merchants went bankrupt trying to complete them. Magellan was a Portuguese navigator who'd become convinced that the traditional routes to the Spice Islands were unnecessarily complicated and expensive. He'd served in Portuguese expeditions to the Indian Ocean and had seen firsthand how difficult and costly it was to maintain European trading posts in Asia using the established eastern routes around Africa. But Magellan's proposal to reach Asia by sailing west wasn't based on careful mathematical calculations or superior geographical knowledge. It was based on a series of dreams where he saw himself sailing completely around the world, proving that the Earth was much smaller than contemporary geographers believed, and that the Pacific Ocean could be crossed in a matter of weeks rather than months. The conventional wisdom in 1519 was that the Pacific Ocean was impossibly vast, a body of water so large that no ship could carry enough supplies to cross it. Even optimistic estimates suggested that sailing from South America to Asia would take at least 6 months of open ocean travel, which was far beyond the capabilities of 16th century ships and navigation technology. Magellan's dreams showed him a completely different reality. In his sleeping visions, he sailed through a strait at the southern tip of South America and emerged into a Pacific Ocean that was much smaller and more manageable than anyone had imagined. The Dream Pacific could be crossed in about 6 weeks, challenging but not impossible with proper planning. The dreams were remarkably specific about the geography of this western route to Asia. Magellan could see the exact location of the strait that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the seasonal weather patterns that would affect the crossing, and even the approximate locations of islands that could provide fresh water and supplies during the Pacific voyage. But perhaps the most important aspect of Magellan's dreams was their revelation about the economic potential of a western road to Asia. The dream journey would bypass all the established Portuguese and Spanish trading posts, all the Ottoman and Venetian middlemen, and all the political complications that made eastern routes so expensive and unreliable. In his dreams, Magellan saw himself arriving in the Spice Islands as the first European to approach them from the east, giving him negotiating advantages that no previous explorer had enjoyed. The local rulers were eager to trade with Europeans who could offer direct access to American silver and European manufactured goods. Sometimes the most profitable business plans come from dreams about sailing off the edge of the world. His dreams included detailed visions of the strait at the southern tip of South America, the vast Pacific Ocean, and the Spice Islands that were his ultimate destination. But the dreams also showed him the enormous dangers of the voyage and his own death in the Philippines. The Dream Strait was unlike anything in European geographical knowledge. Magellan saw a complex waterway filled with islands, channels, and passages that would require expert navigation to traverse safely. The weather was treacherous, the currents were unpredictable, and the psychological challenge of sailing through unknown waters would test even experienced crews. But the dreams also revealed that this strait was navigable, that ships could successfully pass from the Atlantic to the Pacific if they had proper guidance and sufficient determination. Magellan learned exactly which channels were deep enough for large ships, which areas were blocked by underwater rocks, and even which times of year provided the most favorable sailing conditions. The Pacific crossing in Magellan's dreams was equally challenging but ultimately achievable. He saw his ships sailing for weeks across waters so vast that they seemed to stretch to infinity, but he also saw islands that could provide fresh water and food during the most difficult parts of the journey. The Dream Pacific wasn't empty. It contained islands with friendly populations, favorable wind patterns that could speed the crossing, and even marine life that could supplement shipboard food supplies. Magellan learned how to use Pacific weather patterns to his advantage and how to maintain crew morale during extended periods of open ocean sailing. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of Magellan's dreams was their revelation about his own fate. He saw himself achieving the geographical discoveries that would prove his theories correct, but he also saw his death in a conflict with indigenous peoples in the Philippines. This prophetic aspect of the dreams created a complex psychological dynamic for Magellan. He understood that his voyage would succeed in proving that the world could be circumnavigated, but he also knew that he wouldn't survive to see its completion. When Magellan finally convinced the Spanish crown to fund his expedition, he was following a detailed plan that had been revealed to him through his sleeping visions. The preparations were guided entirely by geographical and logistical knowledge he'd gained through dreams. Magellan's route planning was based entirely on his dream guidance. He knew exactly where to look for the strait that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific, how to navigate the complex geography of southern South America, and even how to manage the psychological challenges his crew would face during the Pacific crossing. The expedition that Magellan assembled was specifically designed for the challenges he'd seen in his dreams. He selected ships that could handle both Atlantic storms and Pacific calms, crews that could endure extended ocean voyages, and supplies that would last through a journey that could take several years. The voyage itself unfolded exactly as Magellan had dreamed it. The expedition successfully found and navigated the strait that now bears his name, emerged into the Pacific Ocean, and began the trans-Pacific crossing that would prove the Earth could be circumnavigated. Magellan's navigation of the strait was guided entirely by knowledge he'd gained through his dreams. He knew which channels were navigable, how to handle the treacherous weather conditions, and even how to maintain crew discipline when sailors became convinced they were sailing into certain death. The Pacific crossing followed Magellan's dream route with remarkable accuracy. His ships found the islands he'd seen in his sleeping visions, encountered the weather patterns he'd predicted, and maintained the course that would lead them to the Spice Islands. But the psychological impact of the Pacific crossing on Magellan's crew was exactly what his dreams had predicted. The vast empty ocean, the weeks of sailing without sight of land, and the growing realization that they were farther from home than any Europeans had ever been created psychological pressures that tested everyone's resolve. Magellan's death in the Philippines occurred exactly as his dreams had foreseen. He was killed in a conflict with local rulers, but his expedition continued under different leadership and eventually completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. The completion of Magellan's voyage proved that his dream guidance had been remarkably accurate. The Earth was indeed smaller than most geographers had believed. The Pacific Ocean could be crossed by European ships, and a western route to Asia was geographically possible. Sometimes your dreams show you glory and death in the same vision. The long-term consequences of Magellan's dream-guided expedition were enormous. His voyage proved that the Earth was a globe that could be circumnavigated, established new understanding of global geography, and opened up possibilities for global trade that would influence economic development for centuries. The psychological impact of Magellan's successful circumnavigation on European understanding of global geography was revolutionary. His voyage demonstrated that the world's oceans were all connected, that global navigation was technically possible, and that European maritime technology was sophisticated enough to support worldwide exploration. Magellan's dream-guided approach to Pacific navigation also established principles of long distance, ocean exploration that influenced maritime development for generations. His techniques for maintaining crew morale during extended voyages, managing supplies during transcontinental journeys, and adapting to completely unknown geographical conditions became foundational elements of global exploration. The economic model that Magellan pioneered, using circumnavigation to access Asian markets while bypassing established trade routes, inspired subsequent attempts at global commerce that would eventually create the first truly worldwide trading systems. Modern historians have studied Magellan's expedition extensively, noting the remarkable accuracy of his geographical predictions and his ability to navigate unknown waters with confidence that seemed to exceed available knowledge. Some propose that his dreams represented sophisticated unconscious processing of geographical information, while others suggest that the psychological confidence provided by supernatural guidance allowed him to make better decisions during the voyage. But regardless of the mechanism behind his dream guidance, Magellan's circumnavigation remains one of the most geographically significant examples of sleep vision leading to global discovery. His willingness to trust his subconscious knowledge literally proved that the Earth was round and navigable, fundamentally changing human understanding of planetary geography. The navigational innovations Magellan developed based on his dream guidance became standard elements of global exploration. His understanding of how to navigate straits, cross oceans, and manage the psychological challenges of worldwide voyages influenced maritime technology and technique for centuries. Magellan's story demonstrates how individual vision and courage, guided by supernatural insights, could achieve discoveries that seemed impossible according to existing geographical knowledge. His dream-guided circumnavigation opened up the entire planet to European exploration and established the foundation for the first global maritime trading systems. The psychological techniques Magellan developed for maintaining crew morale during voyages that exceeded all previous human experience became foundational elements of long-distance exploration. His understanding that successful global navigation required psychological preparation as well as technical skill influenced maritime culture for generations. The accuracy of Magellan's dream guidance about global geography has inspired research into the relationship between consciousness and geographical information. Some researchers propose that intense focus on exploration challenges might allow navigators to access information through quantum consciousness or intuitive synthesis that transcends normal sensory limitations. But regardless of the underlying mechanism, Magellan's dream-guided circumnavigation remains a remarkable example of how individual consciousness can access information that transcends normal human knowledge and achieve discoveries that literally change the world. His willingness to follow his sleeping visions around the entire planet proved that the Earth was navigable and opened up possibilities for global exploration and trade that transformed human civilization. John Cabot's voyage to North America was guided by dreams about a northern route to Asia that would be shorter and safer than Columbus's southern approach. But let me explain what Cabot was dealing with in 1497, because this guy was basically trying to one-up Christopher Columbus while working with a fraction of the resources and none of the Spanish backing. Cabot was a Venetian navigator living in England, which meant he had all the maritime expertise of Italian city-states, but was working for a kingdom that was still figuring out how to build ships that didn't sink in rough weather. The English were desperately jealous of Spanish success in the Americas. Columbus had returned from his first voyage in 1493 with stories and samples that proved there were profitable lands across the Atlantic, but the Spanish had quickly claimed everything in the warmer latitudes. England needed its own route to Asian riches, and they were hoping that a northern approach might be both shorter and less defended by Spanish forces. Cabot had been studying Columbus's reports and Spanish claims, trying to figure out where England might find its own passage to the wealth of Asia. The conventional wisdom was that Columbus had found the outer islands of Asia, and that the mainland with its cities of gold and spice markets must be located somewhere nearby. But Cabot's dreams showed him something completely different. Instead of tropical islands and golden cities, he saw himself landing on a coast that was forested and rocky, very different from the Caribbean islands that Columbus had described. The landscape in his dreams was harsh but abundant, filled with resources that would be valuable for European trade, even if they weren't the silks and spices of Asia. The dream coast was remarkably specific for someone who'd never been to North America. Cabot could see rocky headlands, deep harbors, and extensive forests that suggested a substantial landmass rather than just another island. The coastline stretched endlessly in both directions, implying that this was part of something much larger than the islands Columbus had found. In his dreams, Cabot saw indigenous peoples with different cultures and technologies from those Columbus had encountered. These weren't the tropical island peoples that Spanish explorers had described, but populations adapted to colder climates with sophisticated hunting and fishing technologies. The dream inhabitants weren't wearing gold jewelry or living in cities. They were practical people who developed technologies for surviving in harsh northern climates. But they had access to resources that would be incredibly valuable in European markets: furs, fish, and timber that could supply needs that tropical colonies couldn't meet. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are the ones that don't glitter. Cabot's dreams also revealed something that would prove strategically important: This northern land was part of a much larger continental system. He saw vast forests, major river systems, and geographical features that suggested land masses of continental scale rather than just large islands. The dream geography showed Cabot that while this northern route might not lead directly to Asian spice markets, it would provide access to resources and territories that could be equally valuable for English economic development. The land itself could support permanent settlements, and its natural resources could provide the foundation for English colonial expansion. When Cabot finally convinced King Henry VII to fund his expedition, he was working with minimal resources compared to Spanish expeditions. He had one small ship, the Matthew, and a crew of about 18 men. But his dream guidance had given him realistic expectations about what he would find and what would be required for successful exploration. Cabot's 1497 voyage followed his dream route exactly, sailing northwest from Bristol until he reached the coast of what we now call Newfoundland. His landing on June 24, 1497, was the first documented European contact with the North American mainland since the Vikings. The coast Cabot found matched his dream descriptions perfectly: rocky, forested, and clearly part of a substantial landmass rather than just another island. He immediately understood that this was something different from Columbus's discoveries, something that represented an entirely new geographical reality. But perhaps the most important aspect of Cabot's dream-guided discovery was what it revealed about the economic potential of North America. Even though this wasn't the direct route to Asia that he'd been seeking, Cabot understood that the resources he'd found could be equally valuable for English development. The fishing grounds off Newfoundland, which Cabot's dreams had shown him, would become one of the most valuable resources in the North Atlantic. The cod fisheries that European fleets would exploit for centuries were first identified through Cabot's dream-guided exploration. The psychological impact of Cabot's discovery on English colonial ambitions was enormous. His voyage proved that England could compete with Spain in Atlantic exploration and that there were valuable territories available for English colonization, even if they weren't the tropical paradise that Spanish explorers had found. Cabot's dream-guided approach to northern exploration also established principles for English colonial development that emphasized practical resources and permanent settlement rather than just extraction of precious metals. His understanding that North America's value lay in its land and renewable resources rather than its gold-influenced English colonial strategy for centuries. The accuracy of Cabot's dream guidance about North American geography has inspired research into how explorers could access information about unknown territories through supernatural means. His detailed knowledge of coastlines, resources, and indigenous populations all proved remarkably accurate, despite being based entirely on information he'd received while asleep. Modern analysis of Cabot's exploration reveals innovations in northern navigation and resource assessment that went beyond simple geographical discovery. His systematic approach to evaluating colonial potential, his understanding of how to adapt European technologies to North American conditions, and his ability to recognize valuable resources that weren't immediately obvious were all remarkably sophisticated for the late 15th century. Cabot's story demonstrates how dream-guided exploration could identify opportunities that conventional geographical thinking might have overlooked. His willingness to follow his sleeping visions to a harsh northern coast instead of seeking tropical wealth opened up an entire continent to European development. The long-term consequences of Cabot's dream-guided discovery were enormous. His voyage established English claims to North American territory and provided the geographical knowledge that would guide English colonization efforts for centuries. The fishing industry, timber trade, and fur commerce that developed based on his discoveries became foundational elements of English colonial economy. Cabot's integration of supernatural guidance with practical resource assessment became a template for English exploration that emphasized careful evaluation of colonial potential rather than just seeking immediate wealth. His approach influenced English colonial strategy throughout North America and contributed to the development of permanent settlements rather than just extraction operations. The psychological techniques Cabot developed for accessing and interpreting his geographical dreams influenced subsequent generations of English explorers. Many successful North American expeditions adopted similar approaches to using sleeping visions for territorial assessment and resource identification. Cabot's dream-guided discovery also had important consequences for indigenous populations throughout North America. His voyage initiated European contact with native societies and began cultural exchanges that would profoundly affect the development of the continent. The navigational innovations Cabot developed for northern Atlantic exploration became foundational elements of English maritime technology. His understanding of how to navigate in colder waters, handle different weather patterns, and identify suitable landing sites influenced English seamanship for generations. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Cabot's story is how his dream-guided exploration contributed to English understanding of global geography and colonial opportunity. His discovery proved that valuable territories existed beyond the tropical regions that Spanish explorers had claimed, opening up possibilities for English expansion that would influence global political development for centuries. The accuracy of Cabot's dream guidance about North American potential has inspired speculation about how consciousness might access information about geographical opportunities that transcend normal human knowledge. His ability to identify valuable resources and assess colonial potential through supernatural means suggests that exploration guided by sleeping visions could provide insights superior to conventional geographical analysis. Modern historians continue to study Cabot's voyage as an example of how individual vision and courage, guided by supernatural insights, could achieve discoveries that reshape human understanding of global geography and create opportunities for cultural and economic development that influence civilization for centuries. Throughout history, different cultures have had fascinating relationships with dreams about travel and exploration, and honestly, the variety of interpretations is almost as entertaining as the journeys themselves. Let's start with the ancient world, where consulting your dreams before major voyages was considered as essential as checking your supplies and weather conditions. Ancient civilizations generally understood that dreams could provide geographical and navigational information that wasn't available through normal means, but they had wildly different ideas about how this supernatural GPS system actually worked. Egyptian sailors were probably the most systematic about using dreams for navigation. They believed that the god Thoth, who controlled both wisdom and navigation, would communicate crucial voyage information through carefully interpreted dream symbols. Before any major expedition, Egyptian ship captains would undergo ritual purification and sleep in temples dedicated to Thoth, hoping to receive divine guidance about optimal routes, weather patterns, and potential dangers. Egyptian dream interpretation for sailors was incredibly sophisticated. They had specific meanings for different types of water in dreams. Calm seas meant safe passage and profitable trade. Choppy waters indicated political troubles at destination ports. And storms suggested that the voyage should be delayed until more favorable spiritual conditions developed. But the Egyptians also developed practical applications for their dream navigation. They understood that different dream symbols corresponded to real geographical features. Dreaming about certain birds indicated the presence of land within specific distances, while dreams about particular fish species revealed information about ocean currents and seasonal weather patterns. The really fascinating part is that Egyptian maritime records suggest this system actually worked. Archaeological evidence shows that Egyptian trading expeditions had remarkably high success rates compared to other ancient civilizations, and their trade networks extended much farther than should have been possible with their available technology. Ancient sailors basically had GPS, except it only worked when they were unconscious. Moving across the Mediterranean, we find that Phoenician navigators developed perhaps the most pragmatic approach to dream-guided exploration. The Phoenicians were essentially the ancient world's premier maritime traders, and they treated dreams as just another form of business intelligence rather than religious revelation. Phoenician dream interpretation focused on practical information that could improve voyage profitability. They paid particular attention to dreams about wind patterns, harbor conditions, and the political situations at potential trading destinations. Phoenician merchants would often delay or accelerate their departures based on navigational guidance they'd received through dreams. But the Phoenicians also understood that dream navigation required verification through empirical observation. They developed techniques for testing dream guidance against practical navigation experience, creating a synthesis of supernatural insight and systematic seamanship that made them the most successful maritime traders of the ancient world. Greek approaches to exploration dreams were, predictably, more philosophical and complicated than everyone else's. Greek navigators believed that dreams about unknown lands were communications from the gods, but they spent enormous amounts of time arguing about which gods were involved and what their motivations might be. The Greeks developed elaborate classification systems for different types of exploration dreams. Dreams that came during the first sleep were considered most reliable. Dreams just before dawn were thought to be prophetic, and dreams during illness or stress were considered unreliable and potentially deceptive. Greek dream interpretation also emphasized the importance of the dreamer's moral character. They believed that only virtuous navigators could receive accurate divine guidance, while corrupt or impious sailors might receive false dreams designed to lead them into disaster. But despite all this philosophical complexity, Greek exploration dreams produced remarkable results. Many successful Greek colonies were established in locations that had first been revealed through navigational dreams, and Greek maritime expansion throughout the Mediterranean was guided partly by supernatural intelligence that proved remarkably accurate. The Greeks basically turned navigation into a graduate-level philosophy course, which is probably the most Greek thing imaginable. Roman approaches to dream-guided exploration were characteristically practical and bureaucratic. The Romans developed standardized procedures for recording and evaluating exploration dreams, with official dream interpreters attached to major expeditions and formal protocols for testing supernatural navigation guidance. Roman maritime culture included the concept of imperial dreams, exploration visions that were believed to serve the interests of the Roman state rather than individual navigators. These dreams were considered especially reliable because they supposedly came from gods who supported Roman expansion and dominance. The Romans also developed sophisticated techniques for distinguishing between reliable and unreliable exploration dreams. They would compare dreams from multiple navigators, look for consistency in geographical details, and test dream guidance against practical sailing experience before committing resources to major expeditions. But perhaps the most Roman innovation was their bureaucratization of supernatural navigation. They created official positions for dream interpreters, established training programs for navigation dream analysis, and even developed standardized forms for recording and evaluating exploration visions. Moving into the medieval period, we find that different cultures developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to understanding the relationship between dreams and geographical discovery. Islamic maritime culture produced some of the most advanced thinking about exploration dreams. Islamic scholars understood that successful navigation required integration of spiritual, intellectual, and practical knowledge, with dreams providing crucial information that couldn't be obtained through normal observation. Islamic dream interpretation for navigators emphasized the importance of spiritual preparation and moral purity. They believed that navigators who maintained proper religious practices would receive more accurate divine guidance, while those who neglected their spiritual duties might receive false or misleading dreams. But Islamic maritime culture also developed practical applications for dream navigation that went far beyond simple religious observance. They created sophisticated systems for correlating dream symbols with geographical features, weather patterns, and optimal timing for different types of voyages. Islamic navigators also pioneered the use of collective dream interpretation for major expeditions. They would gather multiple navigators to share and compare their dreams, looking for patterns and consistencies that might indicate divine guidance for the entire expedition. Islamic navigators basically invented crowdsourcing, except the crowd was composed of sleeping sailors. Chinese maritime culture developed perhaps the most sophisticated philosophical framework for understanding exploration dreams. Chinese navigators believed that successful exploration required harmony between human consciousness and natural patterns, with dreams providing crucial information about how to align human activities with cosmic forces. Chinese dream interpretation for exploration emphasized the importance of understanding seasonal cycles, astronomical patterns, and geographical relationships. They believed that dreams could reveal the optimal timing for different types of voyages, based on the interaction between human intentions and natural rhythms. Chinese navigators also developed meditation techniques designed to enhance the accuracy of exploration dreams. They used breathing exercises, visualization practices, and dietary modifications to prepare their consciousness for receiving reliable geographical guidance through sleep. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Chinese dream navigation was its integration with practical seamanship. Chinese maritime culture understood that supernatural guidance needed to be combined with careful observation, systematic record-keeping, and continuous learning from experience. Medieval European approaches to exploration dreams were heavily influenced by Christian theology, which created both opportunities and limitations for supernatural navigation. Christian doctrine accepted that God could provide geographical guidance through dreams, but it also emphasized the importance of distinguishing between divine and demonic communications. European explorers were encouraged to pray for divine guidance in their dreams, but they were also warned against relying too heavily on supernatural navigation without proper spiritual preparation and moral purification. The Church developed elaborate procedures for evaluating exploration dreams, with trained theologians examining dream accounts for evidence of divine or demonic origin. Dreams that supported Christian mission work were considered divine, while dreams that seemed to promote worldly gain were suspected of being demonic. But despite these theological complications, medieval European exploration was heavily influenced by dream guidance. Many successful voyages were planned and executed based on geographical information that explorers claimed to have received through divine dreams. Medieval European explorers had to worry about whether their dreams came from God or the devil, which probably made route planning extremely complicated. The age of exploration brought new approaches to understanding dream-guided navigation that emphasized empirical verification and systematic documentation. Renaissance explorers began to treat dreams as psychological phenomena that might contain practical information rather than just supernatural communications. Explorers like Columbus and Magellan kept detailed records of their navigational dreams, comparing dream guidance with practical sailing experience and using both sources of information for voyage planning and execution. This empirical approach to dream navigation led to important innovations in maritime technology and technique. Explorers learned to use dream guidance for psychological preparation as well as geographical information, developing techniques for maintaining crew morale and personal confidence during extended voyages in unknown waters. The scientific revolution brought even more systematic approaches to studying exploration dreams. Maritime academies began to collect and analyze dream accounts from successful navigators, looking for patterns and principles that could be taught to future explorers. Modern psychology has revealed that many of the cognitive processes involved in successful exploration, pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and risk assessment are enhanced during certain sleep states. This suggests that historical explorers who relied on dream guidance might have been accessing enhanced cognitive abilities rather than supernatural information. Contemporary neuroscience has shown that the brain processes geographical and navigational information differently during REM sleep when most vivid dreams occur. This could explain why some explorers received accurate geographical intelligence through their sleeping visions. Sometimes the most practical navigation tools are the ones that work while you're unconscious. Modern research on exploration psychology has also revealed that confidence and psychological preparation are crucial factors in successful navigation, particularly during challenging or dangerous voyages. This suggests that belief in supernatural guidance might have provided psychological advantages that improved navigation performance regardless of whether the dreams actually contain supernatural information. The placebo effect in exploration suggests that navigators who believed they had divine guidance might have made more confident decisions. taken more calculated risks, and maintained better crew morale during difficult voyages. This psychological mechanism could explain the effectiveness of dream-guided exploration without requiring belief in actual supernatural communication. Contemporary studies of indigenous navigation cultures have revealed sophisticated techniques for using dreams and altered states of consciousness for geographical discovery. Polynesian navigators, for example, still use dream techniques for long-distance ocean navigation that produce remarkably accurate results. These indigenous practices suggest that the relationship between consciousness and geographical information might be more complex than conventional Western science assumes. Dream guidance might represent sophisticated forms of unconscious pattern recognition rather than supernatural communication, but the practical benefits for exploration remain significant. Modern maritime education increasingly recognizes that successful navigation requires not just technical skill but also psychological preparation, intuitive decision-making, and the ability to synthesize information from multiple sources, including subconscious processing. The integration of historical research with contemporary psychology and neuroscience has created new understanding of how human consciousness processes geographical information and how sleep states might enhance certain types of spatial reasoning and pattern recognition. This research suggests that dream-guided exploration might represent sophisticated applications of unconscious cognitive abilities rather than literal supernatural communication. But the practical benefits for navigation and geographical discovery remain significant regardless of the underlying mechanism. Before we drift off into our own explorations of dreamland, let me share some lesser-known stories about dream-guided discovery that almost nobody talks about. These are the cases that fell through the cracks of history, the ones that are too strange for textbooks but too well documented to ignore. The Venetian merchant's Spice Island Dream 1345. There's a barely documented account of a Venetian spice merchant named Giovanni Bartolomeo who dreamed about islands in the Indian Ocean where cinnamon trees grew so densely that the air itself was flavored with spice. But let me set the scene for what Bartolomeo was dealing with in 1345. Because the spice trade was basically the medieval equivalent of the oil industry, whoever controlled it controlled the global economy. Venice had built its entire commercial empire on being the middleman between Asian spice producers and European consumers, but the routes were long, dangerous, and increasingly expensive. Bartolomeo had been struggling with the economics of long-distance spice trading for years. The traditional routes through Constantinople and Alexandria were controlled by Ottoman merchants who charged enormous markups, and the sea routes around Africa hadn't been discovered yet. Every spice shipment required huge investments with uncertain returns. In his dream, Bartolomeo found himself sailing through waters that smelled like a spice market, approaching islands where the vegetation was so aromatic that sailors could smell land from dozens of miles away. The dream showed him exact sailing directions from known Indian Ocean ports to these aromatic islands. The dream islands weren't just geographically specific, they were economically detailed. Bartolomeo could see exactly which spices grew where, how they were harvested and processed, and even what trade goods would be most valuable for establishing commercial relationships with local populations. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Bartolomeo's dream was its accuracy about political conditions in the Indian Ocean. He learned which local rulers would be friendly to Venetian traders, which ports were controlled by hostile powers, and even which seasons provided the most favorable trading conditions. The dream guidance included specific intelligence about indigenous trading practices, optimal timing for different types of commercial negotiations, and even cultural protocols that would be necessary for establishing successful business relationships. Bartolomeo invested his entire fortune in organizing an expedition based on his dream guidance. This wasn't just a minor business venture. He was risking everything he owned on the accuracy of information he'd received while asleep. His ships followed the exact route from his sleeping vision and discovered spice sources that made Venice wealthy for generations. The islands he found were exactly as his dreams had described, so rich in aromatic plants that approaching vessels could smell the spices from miles away. Sometimes the most profitable business plans come from dreams that literally smell like money. But the really fascinating part is how Bartolomeo's dream-guided discovery influenced Venetian commercial strategy for centuries. His successful voyage established trade, relationships, and geographical knowledge that became foundational elements of Venetian maritime empire. The spice sources Bartolomeo discovered through his dreams remained closely guarded Venetian secrets for decades, giving Venice crucial advantages in European spice markets that helped maintain their commercial dominance throughout the Renaissance. The Arctic Wayer's ice-free passage, 1611, during the early 17th century, an English whaler named Thomas Whitmore had recurring dreams about a warm water passage through Arctic ice that would allow year-round navigation to Asian markets. Now, let me explain what Whitmore was dealing with in 1611. Because Arctic whaling was basically the most dangerous job in the world, imagine trying to hunt massive sea monsters in waters that could freeze your ship solid at any moment, while being completely cut off from any possibility of rescue if things went wrong. Whitmore had been whaling in Arctic waters for over a decade, and he'd become obsessed with reports of ice-free passages that might connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The economic potential was enormous. A northern route to Asia would bypass all the established European trading monopolies and provide direct access to Chinese and Japanese markets. But previous attempts to find northern passages had all ended in disaster. Ships became trapped in ice, crews died of scurvy and exposure, and even the most experienced Arctic navigators had been defeated by the harsh conditions and unpredictable weather. Whitmore's dreams showed him navigating through Arctic waters that were mysteriously free of ice, despite being farther north than any known ice-free waters. The dream passage connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through waters that seemed geographically impossible. The dream route wasn't just ice-free, it was warm enough to support navigation year-round. Whitmore could see steam rising from the water, suggesting geothermal activity that kept the passage open even during the harshest Arctic winters. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Whitmore's dreams was their revelation about the wildlife in this warm water passage. He saw whales, seals, and fish species that didn't exist in normal Arctic waters, suggesting that this passage supported a unique ecosystem that was isolated from surrounding ice-covered regions. The dream passage also contained indigenous populations that had adapted to this unusual Arctic environment. Whitmore saw peoples with sophisticated ice navigation, technologies and cultural practices that were unlike anything European explorers had encountered in other Arctic regions. Whitmore's attempts to follow his dream guidance led to important discoveries about Arctic geography and ice patterns, though he never found the warm water passage from his dreams. His explorations provided valuable intelligence about Arctic navigation that influenced subsequent attempts to find northern passages. But the really fascinating part is how Whitmore's dream guidance proved to be geographically prophetic. Modern Arctic research has revealed that climate change is creating exactly the kind of ice-free passages that Whitmore dreamed about over 400 years ago. Sometimes your dreams are just a few centuries ahead of schedule. Contemporary satellite imagery shows that Arctic ice patterns are changing in ways that match Whitmore's dream descriptions with remarkable accuracy. The passages he saw in his sleeping visions are now becoming reality as global warming transforms Arctic geography. The Portuguese navigator's Southern Star Map, 1488, a Portuguese navigator named Miguel Santos, had dreams about navigating using star patterns that were only visible from the southern hemisphere, years before any European had sailed south of the equator. Santos was working for Portuguese expeditions that were slowly exploring the African coast, trying to find a sea route to India that would bypass Ottoman control of overland trade routes. But in 1488, no European had successfully rounded the southern tip of Africa, and nobody knew what star patterns would be visible from southern waters. Navigation in the 15th century depended entirely on celestial observation. Sailors used the positions of stars, planets, and the sun to determine their location and direction. But European navigation techniques were based entirely on northern hemisphere astronomy, and nobody knew what to expect if they sailed south of the equator. Santos dreamed about constellations that didn't exist in northern hemisphere skies, and he developed navigation techniques based on dream stars that proved remarkably accurate when Portuguese explorers actually reached southern waters. In his dreams, Santos could see star patterns that were completely different from anything visible from European latitudes. The dream stars moved in directions that seemed impossible, and familiar constellations appeared upside down or in completely different positions. But the most remarkable aspect of Santos's dreams was their accuracy about southern hemisphere navigation. He learned how to use the Southern Cross for directional orientation, how to calculate latitude using star positions that were only visible south of the equator, and even how to predict weather patterns based on southern celestial observations. Santos developed navigation tables based entirely on his dream observations, creating star charts that wouldn't be verified by actual observation for another decade. His dream navigation methods were so precise that Portuguese naval schools used his star maps for decades. Sometimes the best navigation charts come from stars that you can only see when your eyes are closed. The psychological impact of Santos's dream-guided astronomy on Portuguese exploration was enormous. His accurate predictions about southern navigation gave Portuguese explorers the confidence to attempt voyages that had previously seemed impossible. Santos's dream navigation techniques became foundational elements of Portuguese maritime expansion, influencing exploration throughout the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean. His understanding of southern hemisphere astronomy, gained entirely through sleeping visions, provided crucial knowledge for the age of exploration. Modern astronomical analysis has confirmed the remarkable accuracy of Santos's dream navigation. His star charts and celestial observations, based entirely on information he'd received while asleep, proved to be more accurate than many navigation tables created through direct observation. The island that moved, 1520, perhaps the strangest case involves a Spanish navigator named Carlos Mendoza, who dreamed repeatedly about an island that appeared in different locations depending on the time of year, as if it were somehow mobile. Mendoza was exploring the Caribbean in the early 16th century, mapping islands and establishing Spanish territorial claims throughout the region. But he kept having dreams about an island that didn't behave according to normal geographical rules. In his dreams, this island would appear in one location during certain seasons, then disappear and reappear somewhere else entirely. The island seemed to move according to patterns that were related to ocean currents, wind directions, and even lunar cycles. The dream island wasn't just geographically mobile, it was economically valuable. Mendoza saw gold deposits, fresh water springs, and indigenous populations that possessed technologies and knowledge that didn't exist on other Caribbean islands. But perhaps the most puzzling aspect of Mendoza's dreams was how they suggested that this mobile island had been deliberately hidden by its inhabitants using technologies that European explorers couldn't understand. The island's movement seemed to be controlled rather than random. Mendoza spent years searching for this mobile island, following his dream guidance through waters that often proved to be empty. But occasionally he would find evidence of recent human activity in locations where his dreams had placed the island: fresh water sources, cleared vegetation, and even temporary structures that suggested recent habitation. Modern researchers have proposed that Mendoza's mobile island might have been a large indigenous flotilla that moved seasonally throughout the Caribbean, creating the appearance of a moving landmass. This would explain both the mobility and the advanced technologies that Mendoza described in his dreams. Sometimes the most impossible discoveries are just really good camouflage. The really fascinating aspect of Mendoza's story is how it suggests that indigenous populations might have developed sophisticated strategies for avoiding European contact by maintaining mobile communities that could disappear and reappear at will. Contemporary archaeological research has found evidence of large-scale indigenous, maritime communities in the Caribbean that might explain Mendoza's mobile island dreams. These floating settlements could have created exactly the kind of geographical confusion that Mendoza described. The mapmaker's prophetic atlas, 1592, our final obscure story, involves an English cartographer named William Thornbridge, who created maps of undiscovered territories based entirely on geographical information he'd received through dreams. Thornbridge was working during the height of the Age of Exploration, when accurate maps were literally worth their weight in gold. European powers were competing to document and claim new territories, and cartographers who could provide accurate geographical information had enormous political and economic influence. But Thornbridge's maps weren't based on exploration reports or astronomical observation. They were created entirely from detailed geographical visions he'd experienced during sleep. His dream map showed coastlines, mountain ranges, and river systems in regions that no European had ever visited. The really remarkable thing about Thornbridge's dream cartography was its accuracy. When explorers finally reached the territories he'd mapped, they found that his dream geography matched reality with precision that seemed impossible for someone who'd never left England. Thornbridge's maps influenced European exploration for decades, guiding expeditions to territories that had first been revealed through his sleeping visions. His dream cartography literally helped reshape the map of the known world. Sometimes the most accurate maps are drawn by people who've never been to the places they're mapping. Modern analysis of Thornbridge's maps reveals geographical knowledge that couldn't have been obtained through any known 16th century sources. His accurate depiction of continental coastlines, river systems, and mountain ranges suggests access to information that transcended normal human capabilities. The psychological impact of Thornbridge's accurate dream cartography on European exploration culture was enormous. His success demonstrated that geographical discovery could be guided by supernatural intelligence, inspiring generations of explorers to pay attention to their own sleeping visions. These forgotten dreams remind us that throughout history, geographical discovery has been guided by visions that transcended the normal limitations of human knowledge and observation. They demonstrate that consciousness and exploration operate by rules that science is only beginning to understand. The common thread in these obscure cases is how dream guidance consistently provided accurate geographical information that couldn't have been obtained through conventional means. Whether the source was supernatural or psychological, the results were tangible improvements in navigation, exploration, and geographical knowledge. What's really fascinating is how these dream experiences consistently provided not just geographical information, but economic, political, and cultural intelligence that proved crucial for successful exploration and colonization. The accuracy of these forgotten dream navigators suggests that consciousness might have access to information about geographical reality that transcends normal sensory limitations. Their stories remind us that the boundaries between individual minds and geographical knowledge might be more fluid than we currently understand. Modern research into consciousness and geographical information processing continues to reveal that human awareness operates by principles that allow access to knowledge beyond the limitations of individual experience. These historical cases might represent early examples of cognitive abilities that science is only now beginning to understand. The integration of historical research with contemporary neuroscience and psychology suggests that dream-guided exploration might represent sophisticated applications of unconscious pattern recognition, intuitive synthesis, and enhanced spatial reasoning rather than literal supernatural communication. But regardless of the underlying mechanism, these forgotten stories demonstrate that throughout history, the most important geographical discoveries have often been achieved by individuals who had the courage to follow guidance that seemed impossible until it proved to be true. If you're somehow still awake right now, which honestly would surprise me at this point, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. And more importantly, have you ever had dreams about places you'd never been that turned out to be real? Maybe not discovering new continents, but perhaps dreaming about locations that you later visited and recognized. And hey, if you've enjoyed this journey through history's most geographically significant sleep experiences, don't forget to subscribe for more explorations into the weird ways dreams have shaped human achievement. We'll be back next week with another dive into how consciousness and adventure intersect in the most unexpected ways. Maybe tonight you'll dream about your own undiscovered territories. Perhaps you'll find yourself exploring landscapes that exist only in your sleeping mind, or maybe you'll receive navigation instructions for journeys you haven't planned yet. Who knows? Maybe while you're asleep, your subconscious will chart a course to discoveries you never knew you were looking for. Sleep well. And remember, sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single dream about horizons you've never seen. See you in your dreams.